Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I had always thought of camping as a retreat, a way to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. I wasn't prepared for the darkness that lurked just beyond the tree line, nor the horrors that awaited me in the depths of the Blackthorn woods. It was late September when I decided to take a solo trip into the woods. I had heard rumors about the place, stories of strange occurrences and people going missing. But those were just stories, right? I dismissed them as mere embellishments, typical campfire tales. After all, I was an experienced hiker and camper, or so I thought. I arrived at the campsite just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birds. I set up my tent in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that loomed like sentinels. As I built my fire and prepared dinner, I felt a sense of tranquility wash over me. But as night fell, an unsettling silence enveloped the woods, as if the forest had drawn a breath and held it. The first night was peaceful enough. I roasted marshmallows, listened to the crackling of the fire, and marveled at the stars piercing through the inky sky. But then, around midnight, I heard it, a low, mournful howl that seemed to rise from the very depths of the woods. It sent chills down my spine. Wolves, I thought. Maybe a coyote. I reminded myself that I was in their territory. But the howl came again, this time closer, almost human in its desperation. It echoed through the trees, twisting and rising into a scream that made my blood run cold. I turned off my lantern, plunging myself into darkness, and strained my ears trying to discern the source. Just then my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into utter blackness. Panic bubbled up inside me as I fumbled for my backup flashlight. The howling continued, growing more frantic. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. Finally, I managed to get the flashlight working again and shone it into the woods. That's when I saw it. A figure stood just at the edge of the tree line, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, impossibly so, and its silhouette seemed to twist unnaturally. I could barely make out its features. Its eyes were glowing, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like two fiery coals. The figure stepped forward, and I caught a glimpse of its face, a grotesque mask of shadows and bone, with a mouth that stretched too wide, revealing teeth like jagged knives. I stumbled back, heart racing, the beam of light shaking as I pointed it at the creature. It let out a sound, a combination of a growl and a wheeze, like it was struggling to breathe. I felt the weight of dread press down on me, urging me to flee. But I was frozen in place, caught in its gaze. With a sudden movement, it lunged forward, and that snapped me out of my trance. I grabbed my gear and took off, crashing through the underbrush, barely able to see where I was going. The howls echoed behind me, more frantic now, a cacophony of voices merging into a single chilling sound. I ran until I couldn't breathe, pushing my body through the thick branches and foliage, desperate to escape. The darkness felt alive, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I was certain it was right behind me, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing but the dense shadows of the forest. Finally, I stumbled upon a small clearing with a dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and broken. I hesitated, but I could hear the creature's howls closing in, and instinct took over. I flung open the door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it tight. Inside, the cabin was empty and decaying, with dust-covered furniture and a musty smell that filled the air. I crept through the rooms, heart pounding, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. The howling outside became frantic, slamming against the cabin like a physical force, rattling the walls. Just then, I noticed something on the wall, newspaper clippings, faded and yellowed with age. I stepped closer, squinting to read the headlines. Local man disappears near Blackthorn Woods. Unexplained howls haunt campers. Mysterious figure seen in woods. A chill raced down my spine. These weren't just old stories, they were warnings. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that the creature outside had claimed its victims, and I was now part of its twisted narrative. I backed away from the wall, heart racing, and turned just as the door rattled violently. Something was trying to get in. I grabbed a rusted piece of metal from the floor and prepared to defend myself. The howling reached a deafening pitch, shaking the very foundation of the cabin. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. A silence fell over the woods, thick and oppressive. I waited, breathless, every muscle tensed. I peered out the broken window, trying to catch a glimpse of the creature. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, and for a brief moment I saw it standing at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing brighter than before. It didn't move, just watched me. I don't know how long I stood there staring back at that thing. The air felt charged with tension, a standoff between predator and prey. And then, without warning, it turned and melted into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like hours, but the silence remained. Finally, I gathered the courage to leave the cabin. I had to get out of those woods. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature. It was gone, but I knew it wasn't finished with me. I stumbled back to my campsite, adrenaline coursing through me. The tent was still standing, untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I hastily packed my things, keeping my eyes on the dark trees around me, ready for anything. As I made my way back to the trailhead, I kept hearing whispers in the wind, calling my name, taunting me. I wanted to scream, to run faster, but I knew that the woods were not done with me yet. I could feel the weight of the creature's gaze lingering on my back, a constant reminder of the terror I had just faced. When I finally reached my truck, I flung my gear in and sped off, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, heart racing and hands shaking. The woods faded behind me, but the whispers didn't stop. I never returned to Blackthorn Woods, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear that haunting howl echoing in my mind. I can still feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting for the day when I might step back into its territory. And I wonder, what would it take for it to finally claim me? The air in the woods felt heavy, almost thick, as I followed the narrow path deeper into the forest. It was supposed to be a relaxing camping trip. Just me, some quiet time, and nature. No distractions, no work, no stress. That's what I needed. It had been months since I'd taken a break, and this patch of wilderness, far from the busy roads and buzzing phones, seemed perfect. The trees were dense, their branches overhead knitting together to block out most of the daylight. Even though it was only mid-afternoon, the forest had a twilight feel, a dimness that set my nerves on edge, though I couldn't explain why. I told myself it was just the solitude, the unfamiliar sounds of nature making my imagination run wild. But something about the way the light didn't reach the forest floor, how the shadows seemed to shift and stretch, kept me glancing over my shoulder. I reached my chosen campsite, a small clearing nestled between towering pines, their bark mottled with lichen. It was eerily quiet. No wind rustling the leaves, no birds calling to each other, not even the distant hum of insects. Just silence. It felt wrong, but I brushed it off. I was just jumpy. After setting up my tent and getting a small fire going, I sat back, trying to enjoy the peace. But that feeling lingered. You know that sensation? When you're being watched. My skin prickled. I scanned the surrounding trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, hidden in the shadows. Nothing. I shook my head. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, poking at the fire to keep my hands busy. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck refused to settle. The first sign that something was off came when the sun dipped below the horizon. It was fast, too fast. One moment, the sky was a dull gray, and the next, it was as if someone had switched off the lights. Darkness pressed in around me, thicker than it should have been, My fire, small and crackling, seemed like the only point of warmth in an endless void. And then the noises started. At first they were distant, low, guttural sounds, almost like animals, but not quite. They came from deep within the forest, far beyond the reach of my firelight. I tried to tell myself it was just wildlife, but each sound was wrong, somehow distorted, like it was trying to imitate something it didn't quite understand. A snapping twig, a rustle of leaves. Something was moving out there, just beyond where I could see. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and pointed it into the trees. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating only thick trunks and tangled undergrowth. But the noises stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sounds. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, straining my ears for any sign of movement. Minutes passed. My breath sounded too loud in the quiet. Maybe it was just some animal, curious about the fire. Or maybe it was nothing at all. And then I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of the light's reach, partially obscured by the trees. "Hey," I called out, more to reassure myself than anything. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I pointed the flashlight toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. But as soon as the beam touched where it had been, nothing. No one was there. A cold sweat broke out along my spine. I stood frozen, staring at the spot for what felt like an eternity. The fire crackled behind me, but the rest of the world was unnaturally still. Then came the smell. It hit me like a wave, sickly sweet, like rot mixed with something metallic. My stomach churned. It was so strong that I could taste it in the back of my throat. I stumbled back toward the fire, desperate for the warmth and light. My eyes darted to the trees, scanning for movement, but I saw nothing. Yet the smell grew stronger. I wasn't alone out here. That much was clear now. I grabbed the hatchet from my gear and held it tight, my knuckles white. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave, to get out of these woods. But leaving meant heading into that blackness, into whatever was out there watching me. Another snap echoed from the forest, closer this time. I swung the flashlight toward the sound and saw something. Not a person, not an animal. It was hunched, its body twisted and wrong, with long, thin limbs that didn't seem to belong to it. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tight over its bones, and its eyes were glowing. I blinked, convinced I was imagining it. But it moved. Fast. Too fast. The thing darted between the trees, a blur of sickly flesh, before disappearing into the dark. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my pack, my heart racing. My mind scrambled for explanations, but none of them made sense. What the hell had I just seen? My legs felt weak, like they might give out, but I forced myself to stay on my feet. Suddenly there was a sound, a voice, low and garbled, coming from deep in the woods. "Help me!" It was faint, almost like it had been carried on the wind. But it was unmistakable, and it wasn't far away. "Hello?" I called out, though my voice trembled. "Who's out there?" "Help. Me." The voice came again, closer now, clearer. But there was something wrong with it, something deeply wrong. The tone was off, the cadence unnatural, as if whoever was speaking didn't fully understand how to use their voice. I shined the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the light only revealed more trees and darkness. The smell of rot grew stronger. And then, from the edge of the clearing, I saw it again, the figure. But this time it was standing upright, its limbs impossibly long, its head cocked to one side like a curious animal. It took a step closer, and in the flickering light of the fire I saw its face. No, not a face. It was wearing a face. My face. The skin was stretched across its skull like a mask, too tight, too perfect. Its mouth twitched, trying to form words. "Help. Me." but the voice wasn't mine. It lunged. Everything went black. When I woke, the fire was out. The woods were silent. I was alone, and all I could smell was rot. I've always loved camping, the peace, the quiet, the crackling of a campfire under a blanket of stars. It's like stepping out of time. I've been doing it since I was a kid, and I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness had to offer. But I was wrong. Last summer I decided to do something different, something off the beaten path. No campgrounds, no marked trails, just pure wilderness. There's this spot about 50 miles deep into a national forest that I'd heard about from a fellow outdoorsman. He warned me it was remote and not often traveled. But that's exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, just me in the wild. The first day was uneventful. I hiked through some thick forest, the air rich with the smell of pine and earth. I set up camp by a small stream, fished a little, cooked some trout over the fire, and watched the stars blink into view. It was perfect. But that night something felt off. It started with the sounds. When you're deep in the woods, you get used to certain noises, wind in the trees, nocturnal animals rustling through the underbrush, the distant calls of owls. But this was different. It was subtle at first, almost like a faint hum, but as the night went on, it grew louder. I couldn't place it, just this low, droning sound like something big was moving through the forest, but too far away for me to make out clearly. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded unnatural. It wasn't rhythmic like the wind. It was random, stuttering almost, like something struggling to breathe. I should have packed up right then and there, but I didn't. I just stoked the fire a little higher and forced myself to go to sleep. The next day I woke up feeling groggy, like I hadn't slept at all. The air felt heavier somehow, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. I packed up and moved deeper into the forest, pushing toward the area I'd heard about, the untouched part where no one ever goes. The farther I hiked, the more isolated I felt. By midday, even the birds had stopped chirping. The forest around me seemed dead. No wind, no movement, just trees standing still like towering sentinels. That strange hum from the night before had returned, faint but ever present, like it was following me. By late afternoon, I found a clearing, a perfect spot to set up camp again. As I unpacked, I noticed something strange. There were markings on some of the trees, deep gouges that didn't look like anything made by an animal. Long, jagged scratches, almost like symbols carved high up into the bark, too high for any normal creature to reach. I ran my hand over one of the marks, and it was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been in the middle of summer. I tried to shake off the unease and focused on building my fire. As night fell, the hum grew louder again. This time, it wasn't just a background noise. It felt like it was closing in on me. And then the whispers started. At first I thought it was the wind slipping through the trees, but there was no wind. The air was dead still. The whispers were faint, just beyond my hearing, like voices carried from a distance, too far to understand but close enough to send a chill down my spine. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've camped in some pretty remote places, and I know the tricks the wilderness can play on your mind. But this was different. This wasn't my mind playing tricks. Something was out there. I sat by the fire, staring into the dark, flashlight in hand, listening. The whispers grew louder, and now I could pick out words. My name. I swear to God it was my name. Jacob. It came from the tree line, from deep within the woods. My heart started racing. No one knew I was out here. There wasn't another soul for miles. I stood up, scanning the trees with my light, but the beam only pierced the first few feet of the dense woods. Jacob, the voice came again, closer this time. I could feel something watching me from the shadows. Every instinct in my body screamed to get the hell out of there, but I was frozen in place, gripping the flashlight like it could somehow protect me. Then I saw it, just a glimpse at first, something tall, too tall to be human, moving between the trees. Its shape was wrong, elongated and twisted, like its limbs were stretched too far. It moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, almost like it didn't know how to walk properly. "Jacob!" The voice was right behind me now, and I whipped around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing. Just the fire, crackling softly, the only normal sound in an otherwise dead forest. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up what I could, leaving half my gear behind, and started hiking back the way I came. The whispers followed me, circling around, taunting me with my own name. And that hum. It was all around me now, vibrating in my bones, getting louder, closer. As I pushed through the trees, the whispers changed. They stopped saying my name and started imitating me. I heard my own voice echoing back at me from the darkness. It was warped, distorted, but it was me, calling out, begging for help. "Help me, Jacob." I broke into a run, adrenaline flooding my veins. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just needed to get out. But no matter how far I went, how fast I moved, the whispers stayed with me. And worse, that thing, whatever it was, it followed. At one point I glanced back, and there it was, just at the edge of my vision, tall and gaunt, limbs too long for its body, pale skin stretched tight over bone, its head twisted unnaturally, following me as I ran. And its face, God, its face was a blank, empty slate. No features, just smooth, pale flesh. I don't remember much after that. I must have run all night, because the next thing I knew, I was stumbling out of the woods, back onto the main road, drenched in sweat and covered in scratches from the branches I'd pushed through. A search team found me the next day, wandering in a daze miles from where I should have been. I never went back to get the gear I left behind. I never camped again after that. And the worst part? Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it. That hum, faint and distant, but growing closer. And I know deep down, it's still out there. It's still waiting. The drive up to the trailhead took longer than expected. My cell signal was already fading before I turned off the highway, and by the time I parked and killed the engine, I was completely cut off. No bars, nothing. The ranger station, a single squat building tucked into the forest, sat silent. There were no other cars in the lot except for an old Jeep, its tires coated in mud and the windows tinted a strange dark brown. I glanced at the sun hanging low in the sky. It was late afternoon, the perfect time to set up camp and settle in before dark. But I couldn't shake the strange stillness that had settled over everything the moment I'd stepped out of the car. The trees loomed tall and oppressive, their thick branches entwined overhead, casting deep shadows that made it seem like twilight had already begun. I'd come here to escape, to clear my head. A solo camping trip in the deep woods sounded like the perfect way to reset after months of stress at work. And this trail, tucked away in a remote section of national forest, was exactly the kind of isolation I craved. But now, standing alone in that empty parking lot, something felt off. There was no wind, no birds, not even the rustle of leaves. Just silence. I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders and headed for the trail, hoping the oppressive quiet would lift once I was deep into the woods. About 2 hours later, I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. A small, flat patch of earth nestled between two large, moss-covered boulders, with enough space for my tent and a small fire. The hike had been uneventful, though the sensation of being watched had gnawed at me the entire time. I kept hearing faint rustling in the underbrush, soft thuds behind me as if something was following, just out of sight. I brushed it off as deer or small animals, but there was a weight to it that I couldn't explain. It felt intentional, like something knew I was there and didn't want me to be. By the time I finished setting up camp, dusk had settled in. The temperature dropped quickly, and I found myself standing near the fire, staring out into the thickening darkness. My flashlight beam barely cut through the dense trees surrounding the clearing, and every sound, every snap of a twig, seemed amplified. Then I heard it, a low growl so faint I thought I'd imagined it. My heart skipped a beat, and I scanned the tree line with the flashlight. Nothing, just trees, dark and still. I told myself it was probably a wolf or a coyote, but something about it was wrong. It didn't sound like an animal I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural. Hours passed and I sat by the fire trying to shake the unease that had settled into my bones. The growl hadn't returned, but every now and then I heard soft footsteps in the distance. At first, they were sporadic, faint, but as the night wore on, they grew louder, closer, circling the campsite. I gripped the hatchet I'd brought, heart pounding. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into near-total darkness. The fire was my only light, its flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Then, just beyond the glow of the fire, I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a hunched figure barely visible through the thick underbrush. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, gangly limbs. Its head was misshapen, elongated, like a deer's skull, but with something wrong about it. The skin, pale and stretched tight over bone, gleamed in the firelight. It stood there, unmoving, watching me. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs refused to move. Suddenly, it shifted, moving with an unnatural, jerking gait. It stepped into the clearing, its eyes, black, empty holes, locked onto me. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, and landed hard on my back. The creature paused, head tilting in a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. And then it spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was wrong. It sounded like a garbled mix of human and animal, as though it was trying to force the words through vocal cords that weren't made for speaking. I scrambled to my feet, backing away, but the thing just stood there unmoving, watching me with those empty sockets. Without thinking, I grabbed the hatchet and swung it at the thing, but it didn't flinch. My arms trembled, and before I could process what was happening, it turned and vanished into the woods, moving with an eerie, fluid grace. I didn't wait. I threw my gear into my pack, doused the fire, and started down the trail, flashlight clutched tight in my hand. And the further I went, the darker it became. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. Trees closed in, their branches scraping against my face as I ran. I could hear them now, the footsteps heavy and fast following me through the underbrush. I was being hunted, and then I saw it again, standing in the middle of the trail, just ahead of me. The same creature, tall and grotesque, but this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures emerged from the shadows. Some crawled on all fours, others stood tall, their shapes twisted and wrong, like animals that had been stretched and molded into human form. I turned to run in the opposite direction, but I froze. A park ranger stood there, illuminated by the faint beam of my flashlight. Relief flooded through me. I hadn't seen another human since arriving. "Thank God," I gasped. "I don't know what's happening, but we have to go." But the ranger didn't move. His face was blank, his eyes empty, hollow. And then he smiled. It wasn't a smile of reassurance, but something dark, predatory. "That's not how this ends," he said, his voice low and inhuman. As he stepped closer, his face began to change, stretching, contorting. His skin peeled away, revealing something beneath, something that shouldn't exist. The creatures surrounded me, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't hunting me. They were welcoming me. I looked down at my hands, long, skeletal, the skin stretched tight, and felt the hunger stir deep inside. I've always loved camping, the serenity of being far from the city, the clean air, the stars, and the quiet. So when I found a remote spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, I couldn't resist. My buddy Matt bailed at the last minute, so I ended up going alone. Honestly, I didn't mind. A solo trip felt like the perfect way to clear my head. I arrived late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the tree line. The campsite was perfect, nestled between towering pines with a small clearing for my tent and a creek nearby for water. I set up quickly, proud of how at ease I was out here. It was peaceful, the only sounds being the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. But as twilight settled, that peace began to shift. It started with small things. The woods felt different as the light faded. The chirping of crickets seemed muted, the breeze a little too still. I brushed it off as pre-dusk nerves, the kind that come from being truly alone in a place where the shadows are long and the trees stretch tall and dense around you. I built a fire, settling in with a beer, and watched the sky darken. The stars flickered to life, one by one, like tiny beacons of safety. But the longer I sat there, the more I started to notice a sound, soft, rhythmic, like footsteps crunching through leaves just beyond the firelight. I froze, straining my ears. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled my campsite, slow, deliberate. I shone my flashlight into the trees. Nothing. I couldn't see past the thick brush. My heart was pounding, but I tried to calm down. There was no one out here but me. It had to be an animal, something curious. Yet, a nagging feeling tugged at my gut, telling me it was something else. Something that knew I was there. After a while, the sound faded, but the unease didn't. I should have left then, packed up and gone back to my truck, but I didn't. Instead, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there listening. The woods were silent, too silent. No wind, no insects, not even the distant howl of a coyote, just the oppressive, suffocating quiet. And then came the whisper. It was so faint I wasn't sure I heard it at first, but there it was again, clearer this time. It sounded like my name, drifting on the air. My blood ran cold. I sat up, clutching the knife I kept by my side. "Matt," I called out, my voice barely a whisper. It had to be him. Maybe he'd decided to mess with me after all. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Matt was hours away. The voice was wrong too, distorted somehow, like it was trying to mimic a human sound but didn't quite know how. "Matt?" I repeated louder now. Silence. I lay back down, gripping the knife tighter, my pulse thudding in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, something was tugging at my tent. I bolted upright, heart slamming into my chest. I could hear the nylon fabric stretching, something scratching against it from the outside like claws or fingers. I held my breath, every muscle tensed. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like whatever was out there wanted me to know it was close. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it at the tent wall. Shadows danced, but nothing solid appeared. The scratching stopped. I sat there, knife in hand, for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to start again. But it didn't. When dawn finally broke, I crawled out of the tent, exhausted, but relieved to see the light creeping through the trees. The forest seemed normal again, birds chirping, the creek bubbling. That's when I saw the footprints. They circled my campsite, the grass flattened in strange patterns, almost like hooves. But they were long, elongated, not like anything I'd seen before. They led off into the woods, disappearing into the thick brush. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe some animal had wandered through. But deep down, I knew better. I packed up quickly, eager to put distance between myself and whatever had stalked me last night. As I hiked back to my truck, the woods grew unnervingly quiet again. The further I walked, the heavier the silence became, pressing in on me like a physical weight. Halfway back, I saw him. A park ranger standing at the edge of the trail, staring at me. Relief flooded through me. I hadn't seen anyone in days. "Hey," I called, waving. But he didn't respond. Just stood there, still, watching. Something about him seemed off. His uniform was dirty, tattered at the edges, and his skin was too pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were black, not just dark, but black, hollow. My steps faltered. The relief I felt turned to dread. I forced myself to keep walking, refusing to meet his gaze. But as I passed him, he spoke. "Leaving so soon?" His voice, it was the same distorted whisper I'd heard the night before. I didn't respond. I just kept walking, faster now, not daring to look back. The woods seemed to close in around me, the air thick with something unseen, something watching. I reached my truck and threw my gear into the back, my hands shaking. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The ranger was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. And beside him something else, a figure taller than any human, its skin stretched tight over bones, its eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, but I know I'll never truly escape whatever was in those woods, because sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear that whisper. It's closer now. I love camping. The isolation, the quiet, the feeling of disconnecting from the world for a while, it's peaceful. At least it used to be. I had planned this trip for weeks, meticulously picking out a remote spot in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was far from the main hiking trails, well off the beaten path. No other campers for miles. Just me, my tent, and the sounds of nature. That's how I liked it. I got there in the early afternoon, found a clearing, and set up camp. The sun filtered through the trees in that golden way it does before dusk, and the forest was alive with birds and rustling leaves. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and leaned back against a log, sipping on a cheap beer I'd brought along. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the woods started to change. It was gradual at first. The birds went quiet, and the rustling in the underbrush stopped. Nothing unusual. Just the forest settling into its nighttime rhythm, I figured. But the silence felt different. Heavier. I ignored it and fed the fire, watching the flames dance as the last sliver of daylight disappeared. I had a small lantern with me, but I preferred the light of the fire. It was warmer, more natural. I had just finished cooking a simple dinner when I heard it. A crunch. A heavy footstep on dry leaves coming from the tree line behind me. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I listened carefully, but heard nothing else. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. The woods are full of them. I went back to eating, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then a whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire, but unmistakable. A low, soft whisper, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I turned quickly, scanning the dark woods behind me with my flashlight, but there was nothing there, just the thick shadows cast by the trees. I called out, but my voice sounded small in the dense silence. "Hello? Anyone there?" No answer. Just more silence. I convinced myself it was the wind, though there wasn't any, and settled back down. But the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I'd camped alone plenty of times before. This was no different. But then it happened again. A whisper, this time clearer, closer. It wasn't the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, scanning the woods around me. The beam cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. No animals, no people. Nothing. Still, the whisper persisted, floating in and out like a distant conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I could barely make out the words, but they didn't sound like English. They sounded wrong, twisted. A cold sweat broke out on my skin as I slowly circled the campfire, shining the light into the shadows, feeling like at any moment something would jump out at me. But all I saw were trees, endless and unmoving. I was alone, or at least I should have been. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just tired, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the whispering, it didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, more insistent, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. Then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the firelight, standing perfectly still, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I focused, I realized something was wrong. The proportions were off. Its limbs were too long, the body too thin, and its head, God, its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was broken. I couldn't see its face. It was shrouded in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. For a moment, I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground like something had a hold of me. But then the figure twitched, a quick, unnatural jerk, and I snapped out of it. I grabbed my knife and backed toward my tent, heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now, like dozens of voices all speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it felt malicious. I fumbled with the zipper of my tent, my hand shaking, all the while keeping my eyes on the figure. It hadn't moved. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Just like that. I blinked, shining the flashlight in the spot where it had been. But there was nothing. No footprints. No disturbed leaves. Nothing. But the whispers, they were still there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, waiting for dawn. Every so often I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, but I didn't dare look. I just stayed there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the incessant, eerie murmur of the voices just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. When the first light of day finally broke through the trees, I packed up and left without hesitation. I didn't care about the gear I left behind. I just needed to get out. I practically ran back to my car, the entire time feeling like something was following me, just out of sight. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. I made it back home by midday, exhausted and shaken, but relieved to be away from those woods. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I had just imagined it. But last night, lying in bed, I heard it again. The whispering, faint but unmistakable, coming from just outside my window. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I can still hear them. Those voices, whispering, waiting. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have never gone into the hollow woods alone. Everyone in town said it was cursed, but I thought they were just being superstitious. A place like that? Untouched for centuries, they said. People went in, but not many came out. The ones who did were never the same. It seemed like a challenge to me. I was the new guy in town, the outsider, and I had always loved exploring remote places. I told myself I wasn't afraid of ghost stories. I was smarter than that. I could handle it. Now, sitting here writing this by the dim glow of my flashlight, I realize I was wrong. Horribly, terrifyingly wrong. I went in yesterday morning planning to spend just one night. My pack was loaded with gear, enough food, water, and supplies to last me twice as long, just in case. The trail leading into the hollow woods was overgrown, barely visible in places. The trees were thick, their branches twisted together like they were trying to keep something out, or in. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching on dead leaves and twigs. It was eerie, sure, but not enough to turn me back. I set up camp just before sunset, by a small stream that cut through the dense forest. The place had an ancient feel, like it hadn't been touched by time or people in centuries. The trees loomed overhead, their bark dark and slick, covered in moss and strange, spidery patterns that didn't look quite natural. I shrugged it off, telling myself I'd seen worse, but as the last light of day faded and darkness settled over the forest, the sense of unease grew. It started with the wind, except it wasn't really wind. It was more like a low, constant murmur that seemed to come from all directions at once. At first I thought it was just the trees shifting in the breeze, but then I realized there was no breeze. The air was still heavy. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt alive, not in the normal way forests do with the rustling of animals and the calls of birds, but something deeper, like the ground itself was breathing, pulsing with an unseen force. I told myself it was just nerves. The stories had gotten under my skin, that's all. Then I heard it, a soft rustling just beyond the edge of the firelight. I looked up, my heart thudding in my chest, but saw nothing. Just the dark shapes of trees, their branches swaying slightly in the... What? There was no wind. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it into the trees. The beam flickered slightly as I swept it across the undergrowth, casting long, dancing shadows. Nothing. I sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stared into the darkness, straining to hear anything besides the crackling of the fire and that low, unsettling murmur. Then the whispering started. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, like the sound of the wind brushing through the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct, until I could almost make out words. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood again, shining my light into the trees, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive quiet. "Is anyone there?" No answer, just that whispering. It almost sounded like my name. I turned in a slow circle, shining my flashlight all around the campsite. The forest loomed, dark and thick but empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside the light's reach, watching me. Then just as quickly as it started, the whispering stopped. Silence. I sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. The fire crackled softly, the flames dancing, but the oppressive feeling of being watched didn't go away. And then from behind me I heard it. A laugh, quiet, almost like a child's giggle, but it was wrong, distorted, twisted. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the dark, landing on nothing. My breath came in shallow, panicked bursts. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I grabbed my knife, holding it in one hand while I scanned the trees, my eyes wide, heart hammering in my chest. The woods were too quiet, and the shadows seemed to be moving, shifting just out of sight. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the firelight. Just far enough that I could barely make it out. A tall, impossibly thin shape. Too tall to be a person. Its arms were long, dangling down almost to the ground, its head cocked to one side like it was studying me. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw its face. Pale, hollow, with eyes that were nothing but black pits. I blinked, and it was gone. I stumbled back, falling to the ground, my flashlight rolling away from me. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and the whispering started again, louder this time. Closer. The shadows around me seemed to twist and writhe like they were alive. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling, and shone it into the trees again. There was nothing there, but I knew. Something was watching me. I could feel it, could feel its eyes on me, hear its breath in the rustling leaves. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, watching the darkness, waiting for something to move, to step into the light. The whispering never stopped, and neither did the feeling that I was being watched. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up and started hiking out of the valley, but the trail was wrong. The trees weren't where they should be. Landmarks I had passed on the way in were gone. It was like the forest had shifted overnight, like it was deliberately trying to keep me there. And the worst part? The whispering followed me. Even now, as I write this, sitting in what should be the safety of daylight, I can hear it, just beneath the sound of the wind, just beyond the edge of my hearing. It's getting closer. I don't know if I'll make it out. But if you're reading this, if anyone is reading this, don't go into the hollow woods. Don't listen to the whispers. And whatever you do, don't look behind you. Because once you hear them, they never stop. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend to disconnect, escape the grind, and breathe in the wilderness. Just me, my friend Ethan, and the untamed beauty of the dense Appalachian woods. We'd done this dozens of times, pitching our tent far off the beaten path, miles away from the nearest human being. It was what we lived for, until the night it all went wrong. We arrived late in the afternoon, sunlight dappling through the thick canopy of trees as we found the perfect spot. A clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small creek running nearby. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, the sounds of nature all around us. Rustling leaves, chirping birds, the distant gurgle of water. Everything felt perfect, like nature welcoming us in. The first odd thing happened while we were setting up camp. Ethan had wandered off to gather firewood, and I was hammering down the last tent peg when I heard something. A low, guttural sound, like an animal growl, but distorted. It echoed from deeper in the woods, just far enough that I couldn't place what kind of animal it could be. I paused, listening, but when the sound didn't repeat, I chalked it up to my imagination. These woods were known for their wildlife, after all. Ethan returned, arms full of branches, and I asked him if he'd heard anything strange. He gave me a strange look and shook his head, dismissing it as forest noises. But even then there was something in his eyes. Maybe he had heard it but didn't want to admit it. The sun dipped lower, and we settled in around the fire, cooking our dinner and swapping stories as the sky bled into darkness. The woods were quiet now, unusually so. The normal chorus of crickets and frogs seemed absent, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. The only sound was the crackling of our fire. I tried not to think too much about it, but my nerves were on edge. I could see it in Ethan, too, his usual laid-back demeanor replaced with unease. Every now and then we'd both glance into the shadows beyond the firelight, like we were expecting something to be out there. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. The fire couldn't keep the cold at bay, and a thick fog began to roll in from the creek, swallowing the surrounding trees. It was then that we heard the footsteps, soft but deliberate, just beyond our campsite. Ethan shot me a look, and we both grabbed our flashlights, shining them into the trees. The beams of light cut through the fog, illuminating the underbrush, but there was nothing there. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My heart pounded as we both strained to listen. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "I think we should pack up and leave," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. He wasn't the type to spook easily, but something had him rattled, and it was contagious. We stood, debating whether to take down the tent in the dark or just abandon it, when something moved at the edge of the clearing. Just a shadow at first, slipping between the trees. It was too quick to make out clearly, but it was big, and it wasn't moving like any animal I'd ever seen. The way it slinked from tree to tree, hunched over, almost humanoid. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Did you see that?" Ethan muttered, eyes wide. Before I could answer, the growl came again. This time it was unmistakable, low and guttural but wrong, like multiple voices layered over each other. It reverberated through the trees, coming from all directions at once. We grabbed our packs, abandoning the tent, and started for the trail. As we stumbled through the dark, I felt the undeniable sensation of being watched. No, stalked. Something was out there, pacing us, staying just out of sight but never far behind. We heard branches snap, leaves crunching underfoot, and every now and then that horrible growl. We broke into a full run. My breath came in ragged gasps as the fog thickened, making it hard to see. Ethan was just ahead of me, his flashlight flickering wildly. We were close to the trailhead, maybe a half-mile out, when Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. I slammed into him, almost knocking him over, and followed his gaze. There, in the middle of the trail, stood something. It was hunched over, its back arched unnaturally, with long, bony limbs that seemed too thin to support its body. Its eyes glowed faintly in the beam of Ethan's flashlight, yellow, like a predator's. And its face. It was like it was wearing a mask, a grotesque imitation of a human face, stretched tight over its skull but wrong in every way. Neither of us moved. We were frozen, paralyzed by the thing's gaze. It stood there, silent, watching us with an intelligence that felt far too human. Then slowly it tilted its head, and I heard a whisper, clear as day, but coming from all around us. Run. We didn't need to be told twice. Ethan bolted, and I followed, my legs burning as we sprinted down the trail. The thing didn't chase us, not directly, but I could feel it, feel them. More than one now, watching from the trees, their eyes glowing in the dark, their growls echoing through the forest. We reached the car, fumbling with the keys as the air around us seemed to hum with static. As we peeled out of there, gravel spraying behind us, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. Its head tilted again, that same twisted mockery of a human face, as if it was letting us go. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, deep into the next town. Neither of us spoke, too shaken to even process what had just happened. It wasn't until the next morning, when we checked the footage from the trail cam Ethan had set up at camp, that we saw it. The camera had caught movement around 2 a.m., just before we left. A figure, tall and lanky, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us sleep. Its face was Ethan's, but Ethan was right next to me. We never went back to those woods, and we never talk about what we saw, not anymore. Some things are better left forgotten, but sometimes in the dead of night I still hear that growl, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. I always loved camping alone, the solitude, the quiet. It gave me time to think, to breathe. No distractions, just me, the trees, and the sky. This time I decided to go deeper into the woods than ever before. I found an old trail, overgrown and unused, and followed it for miles until it disappeared entirely. The place I found was perfect, untouched by anyone for what looked like years. The sun was setting when I set up camp. It draped everything in gold and shadow, the trees casting long fingers across the ground. The air was still, but the kind of stillness that felt aware, like the woods were holding their breath. I shrugged off the feeling and got my fire going, trying to shake off the gnawing tension creeping up my spine. As the night settled in, the usual forest noises started up, the rustling of leaves, the chirp of crickets. But it was quieter than I expected. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world around you is listening. My fire was small, just enough to cook some food and keep the night at bay, but it seemed to flicker weaker than it should have. Then I heard it, a distant sound, faint but distinct, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze, listening hard, but there was nothing more. I glanced toward the trees, my eyes scanning the dark gaps between them. Probably just a deer. That's what I told myself. But it didn't feel like that. I sat back down, forcing myself to focus on the fire, on the crackling logs, and the warmth against the chill of the evening air. The wind had picked up slightly, whispering through the branches above, making them creak like old bones. An hour passed, maybe more. The unease still gnawed at me, but I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me. I leaned back against a log and looked up at the stars, trying to let the vastness of the sky swallow my anxiety. That's when I heard it again, a sound closer this time. It wasn't the snap of a branch, it was a voice, faint, carried on the wind. I straightened up, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, but the voice had stopped. Maybe I imagined it. Out here, in the dark, it's easy for your mind to play tricks on you. And then it came again, louder, clearer. Someone was calling my name, and I felt ice crawl up my spine. My name, out here, deep in the woods, miles away from anyone. It was impossible, but I knew what I'd heard. The voice was soft, pleading, like someone was lost. Someone who knew me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it over the trees. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating only trunks and shadows. My fire cast a flickering glow, but beyond that the woods were impenetrable. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "Who's out there?" For a moment the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and then the voice came again, closer, much closer. "Please help me." The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was my voice, and I felt my stomach twist into knots, my blood turning cold. It wasn't just similar. It was exactly my voice, calling out from somewhere deep in the trees. And worse, it sounded off, like a recording played back just a little too slow, a little too distorted. Panic surged through me. I stood up, the flashlight trembling in my hand, shining it into the woods, my heart racing. "Who's out there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Nothing. I should have left. I should have packed up my gear right then and there and bolted down the path. But something held me. Some stupid curiosity, or maybe I was too frozen by fear to move. A branch snapped directly behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam catching something between the trees. It was a figure, standing just at the edge of the light, tall and unmoving. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make out the shape. It was wrong. The figure, it was too tall. Its limbs were long, unnaturally long, hanging limply at its sides, and its face, if you could call it that, was just empty, smooth, like someone had erased its features. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, but the thing didn't move. It just stood there, its head slightly tilted, as if studying me. Then it spoke. "Please, help me." My voice. Again. I blinked, shaking my head. This couldn't be real. I pointed the flashlight directly at it, but the light seemed to waver around the figure, as if it were slipping between the gaps of the trees, never fully illuminated. I took another step back, my breath quick and shallow, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was a trick, some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew better. The thing standing in front of me wasn't human, and whatever it wasn't friendly. The thing moved, not walked, moved. Its body seemed to twitch, jerking forward in an unnatural, almost insect-like way. The smooth face twisted as it leaned closer to the edge of the light, and I swear it began to smile, not with a mouth but with the shifting of skin pulling taut as if it were about to burst. "Help me," it said again, my voice dripping with mockery now, low and slow, like it was savoring the sound. I bolted. I don't remember making the decision to run, but my legs carried me, crashing through the underbrush as fast as they could. The flashlight bounced wildly in my grip, its beam dancing between the trees as I tore through the woods. Behind me I heard the thing. Its movements were erratic, unnatural, like it didn't quite know how to run but was giving chase anyway. The voice echoed after me, distorted and warping as it mimicked me, calling out over and over, "Help me!" I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My only focus was getting out, getting as far away as possible. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees blurring together, the darkness closing in. Finally, I saw the edge of the woods, the trailhead. I stumbled into it, panting, gasping for breath. My legs ached, my lungs burning as I collapsed against the trunk of a tree. The woods behind me were silent. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring into the trees, waiting for the thing to emerge. But it didn't. I don't know how I made it out. I don't know what I saw. But I do know this. The voice that had followed me out wasn't mine. It never was. I've always been an outdoorsman. Growing up in rural Oregon, the forest was like a second home to me. I knew the woods, every trail, every animal, every sound. That's why when my buddy Jake suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the Cascades, I didn't hesitate. A few days away from civilization, that sounded perfect. It was late fall, just before the first heavy snowfall. We found a spot far from any known trails, deep in a section of the forest neither of us had explored before. It was wild, untouched, and eerily beautiful. The kind of place you can't find on a map. A place where it felt like time itself stood still. The first day was great. We hiked, set up camp, and spent the afternoon fishing by a crystal-clear stream. As the sun began to set, we built a fire and settled in for the night. The temperature dropped quickly once darkness fell, but we had enough wood to keep the fire roaring. Around 10 p.m., as we sat around the fire talking, we started hearing strange noises in the distance. At first it was faint, just a rustle here, a crack there. Typical forest sounds, I thought. But then it grew louder, more deliberate. "Probably just some elk," Jake said, poking the fire with a stick. But I noticed the look on his face. He didn't really believe that. The noises were coming from all around us now, circling, almost like something was pacing just beyond the tree line. We both grabbed our flashlights and scanned the trees, but the beams barely penetrated the thick darkness. "Whatever it is, it's big," I muttered, straining my ears to listen. But the sound stopped as soon as I spoke. For a few minutes there was nothing but silence, not even the wind, just the crackling of the fire and the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, we heard it. A whistle, long, low, piercing through the still night air like a blade. Jake looked at me wide-eyed. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crackling fire. The whistle came again, this time closer. It didn't sound like a person, though. It was too strange, too off. It was like someone mimicking a human whistle but getting it wrong. The rhythm was all wrong, too long and slow, like whatever was out there was toying with us. We sat frozen, waiting for something to happen, for something to come out of the trees. But nothing did. After what felt like an eternity, the noises stopped, and the forest returned to its eerie quiet. "Let's just get some sleep," I said, though I didn't really believe I'd be able to. I crawled into my tent, keeping my flashlight and knife close. Jake did the same, and soon we both lay there in the suffocating silence, waiting. I don't know how long I lay awake, listening to every little sound, but eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the clearing. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper just outside my tent. It was so quiet I thought I might be imagining it, but then I heard it again. A voice, low, raspy, my name. "Ian." I froze. My blood ran cold. "Ian, come outside." It wasn't Jake's voice. It was something else. Something wrong. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening. The voice came again, soft but insistent, calling me, coaxing me. "Ian." I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, my hand shaking. The voice was right outside the tent now, so close I could hear the leaves crunching underfoot. "Ian." My heart was hammering in my chest. I glanced toward Jake's tent. He had to be hearing this too, right? But his tent was zipped tight. No sign of movement inside. I steeled myself and called out, "Jake, are you hearing this?" No response. "Ian?" The voice called again, so close now that I could almost feel its breath on the thin fabric of the tent. I couldn't take it anymore. My instinct screamed at me to run, to leave everything behind and get the hell out of there. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The night was deathly quiet again. Too quiet. That's when I noticed something. There were shapes outside my tent. Figures standing just beyond the firelight. I couldn't see them clearly, but they were tall, unnaturally thin, and unmoving. My throat tightened with fear, and I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek through. What I saw made my stomach drop. They were people, or at least they looked like people. But their proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long, heads slightly too large, with skin that seemed to sag unnaturally. They stood in a half circle around the campsite, motionless, watching. Their eyes were hollow, dark, empty. My breath caught in my throat, and I zipped the tent back up, my hands shaking violently. I fumbled for my flashlight, my mind racing. These things, they weren't human. "Ian, come outside." The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. There were multiple, all calling my name in unison, in that same raspy, wrong tone. They were trying to draw me out, but I knew that if I went outside, I wouldn't be coming back. I had no idea what to do. Running didn't seem like an option. They were all around us, and they hadn't moved an inch. I could only pray that they wouldn't come inside the tent. Minutes passed like hours, and the whispers eventually stopped. The forest remained unnaturally still, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Somehow, I managed to stay awake until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and step outside, the clearing was empty. The figures were gone, leaving no sign they'd ever been there. The ground, which had been littered with dry leaves and branches, looked undisturbed. "Jake?" I called, my voice hoarse. No response. I rushed to his tent, unzipped it, and found it empty. His sleeping bag, his gear, everything was still there, but Jake was gone. I searched the entire area, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I packed up as quickly as I could and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the car hours later. I called the authorities, but they never found Jake. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. It was as if he'd simply been erased from existence. I still don't know what those things were or what they wanted. But I do know one thing. They're still out there, waiting, watching, and they know your name. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, monsters, cryptids, it all seemed like fantasy to me. But after what happened on that camping trip, I wish I could still believe it was all make-believe. Now I know better. It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything, a break from the stress of work and life. Just me, my brother Jake, and my old college buddy Kyle. We decided to head out to a remote area of the Ozark Mountains. We'd heard rumors about strange occurrences out there, but we laughed them off. People always try to make the wilderness seem more mysterious than it is. In our minds, the only thing we had to worry about was making sure we didn't run into any bears. We arrived at the trailhead late afternoon, the air heavy with the smell of wet leaves and pine. The woods felt dense, almost claustrophobic, but there was something peaceful about it. We hiked for about 4 miles, deeper and deeper into the forest until we found a small clearing by a creek. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. The sound of rushing water was calming, and the trees around us were tall and thick, like a protective wall against the outside world. That first night things seemed normal. We built a fire, cooked some dinner, and shared a few beers. We talked and laughed, enjoying the break from everyday life. The stars were brighter out there, and as the fire died down, we stretched out on our sleeping bags under the open sky, letting the sounds of the forest lull us to sleep. But in the middle of the night, I woke up. I couldn't figure out what had roused me at first, just an uneasy feeling, like something wasn't right. I lay there for a few minutes, listening to the creek and the rustling of the wind through the trees. Everything seemed normal. And then I heard it, a soft, low whistle coming from the woods. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was deliberate, like someone, or something, was out there, trying to get our attention. I sat up, looking around, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I thought about waking Jake or Kyle, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I lay back down, convincing myself it was just an owl or some other animal. But the whistle came again, this time closer. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. The whistle sounded too human, too calculated. It was almost like someone was calling out, but in a way that didn't make sense, like a mimicry of something familiar but twisted. It sent a shiver down my spine. The next morning I mentioned it to the guys. Jake laughed it off, saying I was probably just dreaming. Kyle looked a little uneasy but didn't say much. We packed up our gear and decided to hike a little further up the creek, hoping to find a waterfall we'd heard about from some locals. As we trekked deeper into the forest, that uneasy feeling followed me. The trees were thicker now, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt like we were being swallowed by the forest. And then, around noon, we found something strange. The creek led us to a small overgrown clearing where a series of wooden structures stood, half collapsed and covered in moss. They looked old, ancient even, like some sort of abandoned settlement. There were no signs of recent human activity, no paths, no fire pits, nothing to suggest anyone had been there in decades, maybe longer. "Whoa," Kyle muttered, stepping forward to inspect one of the structures. "What do you think this was?" "No idea," Jake replied, circling another. "Maybe an old hunting camp?" But there was something wrong with it. The way the buildings were set up didn't make sense. No windows, no doors, just rough wooden walls leaning in strange directions. It didn't look like it had ever been meant for living, more like something had built it but not for shelter. I wandered away from the others toward the edge of the clearing when I saw it. A large stone, partially hidden by roots and overgrown vines, standing upright like a marker, and carved into it were symbols, crude, almost like scratches, but arranged in deliberate patterns. They weren't like anything I'd seen before. They didn't look human. A cold chill crept over me as I stared at the stone. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, like we didn't belong there. "Hey, come look at this," I called out to the others. Jake and Kyle came over, and their expressions turned serious when they saw the stone. "What the hell is that?" Kyle asked, his voice tight. "I don't know," I said, stepping back, "but I don't like it." We decided to leave the clearing. The air felt heavier, thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we hiked back to camp, I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd see something moving in the trees. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest. That night, the whistling returned. It started just after we put out the fire. This time we all heard it, soft, mournful, and coming from the direction of the clearing. Jake and Kyle both went pale as they listened. It was closer now, and it wasn't just one whistle. There were several echoing through the trees, as if whatever was out there had multiplied. "We need to go," Kyle whispered, his voice shaking. "We need to leave right now." Jake nodded, and for once he didn't argue. We grabbed our gear, packed up as quickly as we could, and started the hike back toward the car. But the whistling followed us. As we moved through the forest, the sound grew louder, more insistent. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees, too quick to get a good look at. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing closer, the darkness thickening. And then as we neared the trailhead, it happened. The whistling stopped and the forest went silent. We stood frozen, listening, waiting for something to happen. That's when I saw them, figures, tall and thin, standing just beyond the tree line. Their shapes were barely visible, cloaked in shadow, but their eyes were glowing, pale, unblinking, and fixed on us. "Run!" Jake yelled, and we bolted. I don't remember much about that final sprint to the car. My heart was pounding, my lungs burning as we tore through the underbrush. All I could think about was getting away, putting as much distance between us and those things as possible. We didn't stop running until we were in the car, speeding down the dirt road, leaving the forest behind us. We never spoke about it again. We never went back. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear it again, the whistle, and I wonder if whatever was out there that night is still watching. It's funny how the forest changes at night. I've been a park ranger for 10 years, and in that time I've come to respect the wild, the deep woods especially. During the day, the forest is peaceful, even serene. Birds singing, leaves rustling in the breeze. But at night, that's when it feels alive in a different way. More aware. Last week I was assigned to patrol a remote part of the forest, a place known as Black Hollow. Not many campers venture out there, especially this late in the season. So when the call came in that someone had set up camp deep in the hollow, I wasn't thrilled. Black Hollow has a reputation, one that's passed down by generations of rangers. It's more folklore than anything, tales about strange lights, bizarre noises, and hikers who swear they've seen things moving between the trees. It's easy to brush off those stories until you find yourself out there alone. I left the station around 4 p.m., planning to check on the campers before dark and make sure they were set up safely. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long, slanted shadows over the trail as I hiked deeper into the woods. By the time I reached the area where the campers were supposed to be, the sky had turned a deep, dusky blue, and a thick fog had begun to settle in. I scanned the trees looking for any sign of a tent or campfire, but there was nothing. Just endless rows of trees stretching into the mist. I radioed back to the station to confirm the location, but they insisted the coordinates were right. Someone was out here, or at least they had been. As I started walking deeper into Black Hollow, the feeling of isolation hit me hard. The woods felt claustrophobic, the trees packed tightly together, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The trail became narrower, harder to follow, and then that smell hit me. Rot, like something had been dead for days. I'd come across my fair share of decomposing animals in the woods, but this was different. It was overpowering, almost sweet in its pungency, and it seemed to cling to the air. I pulled my flashlight from my pack, clicking it on as the last of the daylight faded. The beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but thick underbrush and the trunks of trees. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees, just beyond the reach of my light. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or maybe a raccoon, nothing to worry about. But then I saw it again, closer this time. Too fast for a deer, too tall. I called out, "Hello? Anyone out there?" Silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I moved forward cautiously, my hand resting on the hilt of the hunting knife strapped to my belt. As I reached a small clearing, I saw something that made me stop cold. A circle of stones neatly arranged with what looked like small animal bones scattered inside. Some were broken, others charred as if they'd been burned. A strange symbol was etched into the dirt at the center of the circle, one I didn't recognize. Goosebumps prickled across my skin. I'd heard stories about rituals and weird stuff happening in Black Hollow, but I'd always written them off as nonsense. Seeing it up close was something else entirely. I turned to leave to radio the station and report what I'd found, but just as I took a step back, a sound froze me in my tracks. A voice. No, not just any voice, my voice. "Help, over here." It echoed through the trees, distorted like it was being pulled apart and stitched back together again. But it was definitely my voice. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the fog. There was no one. Just that oppressive mist, swirling between the trees. My skin felt tight, like I was being watched from all angles. I shouted again, "Who's there?" But my voice sounded small, swallowed by the woods. Then I heard it again, closer. "Help me, please." The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized something was very, very wrong. That voice wasn't a recording or some kind of trick. It was coming from the woods, but it wasn't just an echo. It was mimicking me, word for word. I backed away, my hand trembling as I raised the flashlight. Shadows shifted between the trees, long and twisted. Something moved just out of view, something tall. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but wrong. Too lanky, too thin. Its arms hung lower than they should, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It took a step toward me, and I saw its eyes, glowing, faintly yellow like embers in the darkness. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction, but the trees blurred together as panic surged through my veins. That thing, whatever it was following me. I could hear it moving quickly through the underbrush, always just behind me, always just out of sight. I burst through the trees into a small ravine, my legs burning from the sprint. I stumbled down a rocky slope and into a shallow creek, the cold water shocking my system. For a moment, everything was quiet. I stood there, chest heaving, trying to catch my breath, listening for any sign of the creature. And then I saw it, in the reflection of the water, standing behind me. It was tall, towering over me with grotesquely long limbs, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its face, or what passed for a face, was smooth, featureless, except for those glowing eyes. And its mouth. It had no lips, just jagged teeth exposed in a permanent grin. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was wearing my uniform, the same brown jacket, the same hat, and it was holding a radio. My radio. Before I could move, it spoke again in my voice. "Help me, please." It took a step forward, and I scrambled up the bank of the creek, slipping on the wet stones, adrenaline pushing me faster than I thought possible. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of footsteps behind me faded, but I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, breathless and shaking. When I burst through the door, Dave, my colleague, looked up in shock. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a half smile. I just stared at him, still gasping for air, and muttered, "There's something out there." Dave frowned, looking concerned. "You're not making sense. Here, sit down. You've been out there too long. But hey, at least you called in earlier, said you were on your way back." I froze. "What are you talking about?" Dave looked confused. "Your voice came through on the radio about 20 minutes ago. You said everything was fine." I slowly turned toward the window. The forest loomed outside, dark and silent. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me yet. "I don't think I'm going to make it out of here. If someone finds this, I hope it serves as a warning. Whatever they say, whatever you hear about this place, it's worse than you can imagine. I should have listened. I should have never come here. I thought it would be a simple solo trip, just me in the wilderness, a weekend to get away from it all. I've been hiking these mountains for years, always careful, always prepared. But this time I went further than I ever had before. Deeper into the woods, into the forgotten valley. Locals won't talk about it. The maps don't show the trails that lead here. But I'd heard the stories, whispers of a place where the trees are older than memory, where the forest itself seems to watch you. It sounded like the kind of thing urban legends are made of, and I've always been drawn to the places that others are afraid to go. So I set out early, the sky just starting to lighten as I hiked up the ridge that overlooked the valley. The air was crisp, fresh, and for the first few hours, it felt like any other trek I'd done a dozen times. But as I descended into the valley, things changed. At first, it was subtle. The birds stopped singing, the usual rustle of squirrels or the occasional deer, gone. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, suddenly stilled, as if the valley had swallowed it whole. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stories get into my head. But then there were the trees. They were wrong. Too tall, too thick, their bark gnarled and twisted, as if something had been twisting them for centuries. The branches hung low, almost like arms reaching out, and the deeper I went, the closer together they seemed to grow, until the sky above was just a patchwork of shadows and faint flickering light. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, damp earth, a hint of rot, but as I continued on, it grew stronger, sour and metallic, like the scent of blood mixed with decay. It was coming from deeper in the valley, drawing me in despite the knot forming in my stomach. I should have turned back. I should have listened to my gut. But curiosity, or maybe something else, pulled me forward. I found the first sign of trouble near a clearing. It was a campsite. No, had been a campsite. A tent shredded to pieces, its fabric hanging in tatters from the trees like grotesque decorations. There were belongings scattered around, a backpack, a boot half buried in the dirt. No sign of the owner. I knelt to examine the tent, my hands trembling slightly. The tears in the fabric weren't made by any animal I knew. They were too clean, too precise, like something with claws or knives had ripped through it. And then I saw the prints, footprints but not quite human, too large, too deep. The toes, they weren't right. Longer, almost clawed, as if whatever made them was walking upright but wasn't human. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and I stood up, scanning the clearing. The feeling of being watched was so intense I could barely breathe. Every shadow between the trees felt alive, shifting and twisting like something was moving just out of sight. And then I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. It wasn't close, but it was close enough. I grabbed my pack and started back the way I came, heart pounding, telling myself I'd be out of the valley in a couple of hours. But the forest had other plans. The trail I'd come in on was gone. I swear I'd followed the same path, but the trees were different now, pressing in from all sides. It was like the valley had shifted around me. The branches above blocked out more light, plunging everything into a dull gray gloom. That's when the noises started. At first, it was distant, barely audible. A rustling in the bushes, the snap of a twig, the faintest hint of movement just beyond the corner of my eye. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. The silence that followed was worse, oppressive, heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then came the voices. They were faint, indistinct, but unmistakably human, whispering, echoing through the trees, too soft for me to make out the words. It sounded like my name. Eric? I froze. I hadn't heard anyone speak my name since I left town, and yet there it was, carried on the still air. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkening forest. The whisper came again, this time from behind me. Eric. It was my mother's voice, but she'd been dead for 5 years. My breath caught in my throat. I'd read about this kind of thing, disembodied voices mimicking loved ones. I didn't believe it. I didn't want to. But there it was, as real as the wind that wasn't blowing anymore. And then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the gloom. It was tall, too tall, and thin, its body twisted and elongated, like something had stretched it beyond the limits of its skin. The face, it was wrong. Pale, featureless except for the eyes. Black, deep, hollow eyes that stared into me, unblinking, unfeeling. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally, like it was studying me, mimicking human behavior but not understanding it. Eric, come here. The voice, my mother's voice, came from that thing. My legs went cold. My mind screamed at me to run, but I was rooted in place, frozen by the sight of it, by the wrongness of it. The figure took a step forward, impossibly quiet, its limbs moving with an unsettling grace. That's when I ran. I don't remember the details. I don't remember how far I went, only that I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were going to burst. The forest around me blurred, the trees twisted, the shadows thickened. But no matter how far I went, I could still hear the voices. Eric, come back. They were louder now, overlapping, changing. My mother. My father. Friends I hadn't seen in years. All of them calling for me, begging me to come back. I kept running, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were closer, always just behind me, just out of sight. By the time I collapsed, the sun was barely visible through the trees, a sickly orange glow filtering through the dense canopy. I was at the edge of the valley, but I wasn't safe. I knew that. Whatever was in there, whatever they were, they had followed me. And now, as the sun sets completely, the darkness comes alive with their voices again. I can hear them just beyond the tree line, whispering, laughing, watching. I don't know how much longer I have. My flashlight is dying and I can't risk moving in the dark. But I can feel them. They're close now. So close. If you find this, don't come looking for me. Don't follow my trail. Don't believe the whispers. The valley. It's alive. And it doesn't let go. I've always been a sucker for isolation. There's something about the deep woods, far away from the noise of the world, that calls to me. So when I heard about the abandoned trails in Crescent Hollow, I packed my gear and headed out for a weekend camping trip. The old overgrown paths had been closed to the public for years, but that only made it more enticing. No people, no noise, just me and the untouched wilderness. The locals weren't too fond of Crescent Hollow, though. They didn't talk about it much, and when they did, there was always an edge of caution in their voices. I stopped at the ranger station to check the map, and the ranger there, a grizzled, quiet man in his late 50s, didn't even try to hide his disapproval when I told him where I was headed. "That trail's been closed for a reason," he said, his eyes narrowing. "People who go that way sometimes don't come back." I smiled, thinking he was trying to scare me off. "I'll be fine. I know what I'm doing." He didn't smile back. "Be sure you do," he said flatly, before adding, "If you hear something strange at night, something that doesn't belong, don't go looking for it. Just stay in your tent." I shrugged it off, thinking it was just local folklore to keep kids from wandering into the woods. But still, the way he said it stuck with me. By the time I reached the old trailhead, the sun was already dipping low behind the tree line, casting long shadows over the forest floor. I found a small clearing just off the trail and set up my tent. The quiet was exactly what I needed. No cars, no phones, no people. Just the wind through the trees and the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. As night fell, the forest came alive with the usual sounds: chirping crickets, distant hoots of owls, the occasional rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. I sat by the fire for a while, just enjoying the solitude, but as the night deepened, the forest began to change. The usual sounds faded, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, like the whole world is holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something was watching me. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, carried on the wind. It didn't sound like an animal, or even like the wind moving through the trees. It sounded like a voice, a human voice, low and breathy, as if someone was speaking just out of earshot. I froze, my back to the fire, listening. Nothing. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, but the voice didn't return. I laughed at myself, trying to shake the unease. It was probably just the wind, right? My mind playing tricks on me. I was in the middle of nowhere, after all. There couldn't be anyone out here. I climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. I lay there for a while, trying to sleep, but I couldn't shake that feeling. The feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. The whisper. Closer this time. I shot upright, my heart racing. The voice was clearer now, but still too soft to make out any words. It sounded like it was just outside the tent, circling the campsite, moving slowly, deliberately. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint light over the clearing. I swept the flashlight across the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing, but I knew what I had heard. I wasn't imagining it. I stepped out of the tent, listening, straining to hear. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily still. But then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard it again, a whisper, like someone calling my name. The voice sent a chill down my spine. I considered going back into the tent, heeding the ranger's warning. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my knife, tucked it into my belt, and stepped cautiously toward the tree line, my flashlight scanning the shadows. The voice grew louder as I walked, pulling me deeper into the woods. It was strange, though. It still didn't sound right. It was too hollow, too disjointed. Like someone was imitating a human voice but didn't quite know how. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too fragile in the silence. The whisper stopped. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard a rustling to my left. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam caught nothing but trees and underbrush. Then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the light, standing between the trees. It was human-shaped but wrong, too tall, too thin, its limbs too long. It was standing perfectly still, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I shone the light directly at it, but as soon as the beam touched it, the figure melted back into the shadows, disappearing without a sound. I backed away, my pulse racing, and turned to run back to camp. But as I did, the whisper came again, right behind me this time, so close it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't look back. I ran through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I burst into the clearing, panting, my mind racing. I could still feel its eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I threw more wood onto the fire, trying to keep it going, and backed into the tent. My hands were shaking as I zipped it up. The whispers had stopped, but the silence outside was even worse. For hours I lay there, too afraid to sleep. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. But nothing came. When morning finally broke, I wasted no time packing up my gear. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get out of those woods. As I made my way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me from the trees. When I reached the ranger station, the same old man was there, leaning against the doorframe, as if he'd been waiting for me. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice calm, almost resigned. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He sighed, looking out toward the forest. "You're lucky," he said softly. "You didn't follow it too far." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to get in my car and leave Crescent Hollow behind forever. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. But the road was empty. Still, the ranger's words echoed in my mind. I didn't follow it too far. I haven't been back to the woods since. Something in Crescent Hollow is waiting, watching, and I'm not curious enough to find out what it really is, because next time I might not be so lucky. The woods have always been a place of refuge for me. Growing up in a small town surrounded by dense forests, I spent my childhood roaming the trails, camping by quiet lakes, and learning every bend and break in the wilderness. That love for the outdoors is what led me to become a park ranger. After years of working in different parks, I ended up stationed at Echo Ridge, a vast, sprawling expanse of deep woods that feels like it goes on forever. I'd been working at Echo Ridge for about a year when I got the assignment to check the northern perimeter, an area rarely visited by hikers. It was late fall, and most of the tourists had long since gone home, leaving the forest eerily empty. It didn't bother me, though. I preferred the solitude. The leaves were turning, the air was crisp, and the sky was that cold, steel gray you only get before winter fully sets in. I set out around noon, planning to make a quick round of the area and then head back to the station before dark. The northern perimeter is a 2-day trek if you take your time, but I knew these trails like the back of my hand, and I could make it to the old fire tower and back in less than 6 hours if I moved quickly. The fire tower. I'd heard stories about it, but like most things in the woods, stories grow with time. Local legends claimed it was haunted, that strange figures had been spotted near it, that people who went there at night never came back. The tower had been abandoned for decades, left to rot as the forest reclaimed the area around it. The idea of it gave me chills, but I figured it was just the wind howling through the old wood that made people nervous. I followed the trail deeper into the woods, the trees growing thicker and more twisted as the hours passed. The silence in the forest was oppressive. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching over dead foliage. That's when I noticed something odd. The path was overgrown. The trail I'd walked dozens of times seemed different. The trees were closer together, the underbrush thicker. It was like the forest had shifted somehow. I paused, looking around, but everything seemed normal, just more overgrown than I remembered. I shrugged it off and kept moving, but an unsettling feeling began to creep up my spine. As I pushed forward, the sky darkened faster than I expected, the clouds blotting out the fading sun. I quickened my pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. After another hour of hiking, I reached the fire tower. The structure loomed over the trees, its wooden beams creaking in the wind. It looked worse than I remembered, weathered, broken, the stairs leading up to the platform barely hanging on. I wasn't planning to climb it, just check the area and get out of there. That's when I saw it, and at first I thought it was just a trick of the fading light. A figure, standing at the base of the tower, barely visible through the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin, like its limbs had been stretched beyond what was natural. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just a tree or a shadow. But then it moved. The figure stepped forward slowly, deliberately. Its movements were jerky, like it wasn't used to walking. The light was fading fast, but I could see enough to know that whatever it wasn't human. Its arms were too long, its posture too hunched, and its face was wrong. It looked like it had been stretched and pulled, as though the skin didn't fit the bones underneath. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively going to the knife on my belt. I had no intention of using it. What good was a knife against something like that? But it was the only thing that made me feel less vulnerable. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing, tilting its head to one side as if studying me. Then, without warning, it opened its mouth. The sound that came out wasn't a voice. It was more like a deep, guttural screech, like the howl of wind through a canyon, but with a rasp that made my skin crawl. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees, making the air feel thick and heavy. I turned and ran. My boots pounded against the uneven ground, slipping on wet leaves and roots as I bolted back toward the trail. The sky was nearly black now, and the only light came from the faint glow of the rising moon. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, the footsteps. They were slow at first, measured as if it was toying with me. But then they picked up speed, crashing through the underbrush, growing closer. I ran harder than I ever had before, my lungs burning, my legs screaming with each stride. The trail had all but disappeared beneath the dead leaves, and I could barely see 2 feet in front of me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. After what felt like hours, I burst out of the trees into a small clearing near the base of the ridge. I stopped, gasping for breath, my heart thundering in my chest. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was silent again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, like the woods were holding their breath. I scanned the trees, my flashlight flickering as I swept the beam across the clearing. There was nothing. No movement. No sign of the figure. Maybe I had lost it. Maybe it wasn't real. But then from the darkness I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. It was my voice. "Over here," it called, mimicking my own voice perfectly. "I'm hurt. Help me." I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I knew better. I knew no one else was out here, that it was impossible for anyone to be mimicking me. "Please," the voice continued, growing closer. "I'm lost." My legs trembled, but I couldn't move. I just stood there staring into the darkness, waiting for it to emerge. I didn't want to see it again, but I knew it was there. I could feel it. Suddenly, from the trees in front of me, a figure stepped into the clearing. It was me. It looked exactly like me. Same ranger uniform, same height, same face. But its eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too dark, like bottomless pits, and its mouth was twisted into a sickening grin, too large for its face. "Help me," it said again, its voice distorted, warped, like a recording being played backward. "Help me." I stumbled backward, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no sense to it. This thing, this imposter, wasn't human. It was something else, something that had taken my shape, my voice. I ran again, my legs barely carrying me as I fled down the trail, the sound of my own voice echoing behind me, distorted and broken. I made it back to the station just before dawn, collapsing in a heap on the floor. My coworkers found me there, pale and shaking, unable to explain what I had seen. They searched the northern perimeter later that day, but there was no sign of the fire tower, no overgrown trails, no clearing. But I know what I saw. And now, every night when the forest falls silent, I hear it. That voice, my voice, calling from the trees. There's something about the woods at night that always unnerved me. Maybe it's the way the trees seem to close in when the sun disappears, or how the wind, which seems so harmless during the day, can sound like whispers when darkness falls. But this trip, it was different. This was the trip that made me swear I'd never camp again. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, just me, my girlfriend Kara, and our friends, Ryan and Jess. We picked a spot deep in the Pine Hollow Reserve, far enough off the beaten path that we were unlikely to see another soul. Just 4 of us, a campfire and the quiet beauty of the forest. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the ridge. It cast an orange glow over everything, the kind that makes you feel like you're in another world, far away from the worries of modern life. We set up camp by a small clearing next to a creek. The water was slow-moving, the air cool and fresh. Perfect. Ryan started the fire while Kara and Jess unpacked the food. I walked a bit further into the woods, not far, just to see what was out there. The trees grew denser as I moved away from the clearing, the air a bit heavier. I don't know what made me stop, but suddenly I felt it. That eerie sensation, like someone was watching me. I turned, half expecting to see one of my friends playing a prank, but there was nothing. Just trees. And silence. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful. More like the forest was waiting for something. Shaking it off, I headed back to the camp, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. As the night fell, we settled around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stupid stories. Ryan, of course, started talking about the legend of the Pine Hollow Woods, a local story we'd all heard but never took seriously. Something about an old man who used to live in these woods decades ago, a recluse who disappeared one night and was never found. They say he still wanders the woods, Ryan said, grinning as he held his marshmallow over the flames, carrying an old lantern. If you see the light, you're supposed to follow it, but no one who does is ever seen again. Kara rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, do we have to do this every camping trip? Ghost stories? Jess snuggled up closer to Ryan. It's just for fun. No one believes that stuff. I laughed, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling I'd had earlier, like the woods were listening, watching. By the time the fire had burned down to glowing embers, we were ready to turn in. Kara and I climbed into our tent, and soon I could hear the soft rustling of Ryan and Jess settling in theirs. The night was cold but clear, the sky full of stars. The perfect night, until the sound started. At first it was faint. I thought it was the wind, moving through the trees, but there was something unnatural about it. A low, rhythmic rustling, like footsteps dragging through the underbrush. I sat up, straining to hear, and gently shook Kara awake. Do you hear that? She frowned, listening. The sound was still there, getting louder. Like something, or someone, was moving through the woods around our camp. What is that? Kara whispered, her voice tight with fear. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was out, the clearing bathed in darkness, and everything looked normal. But the sound was still there, coming from the trees just beyond the camp. Kara, stay here, I said quietly, stepping out of the tent. I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it toward the woods. Ryan? Jess? I called, hoping it was just one of them. But there was no answer, only the steady dragging sound. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the dense branches, was a light. Faint, flickering. It swayed gently, like an old lantern being carried through the forest. Do you see that? Kara asked, her voice barely more than a whisper behind me. I nodded, staring at the light, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't fire, at least not like any fire I'd ever seen. The glow was cold, almost blue, and it seemed to pulse, as if calling to us. Without thinking, I stepped forward toward the light. "Wait!" Kara grabbed my arm. "What are you doing? Don't follow it." But I couldn't help myself. It felt like the light was drawing me in, pulling me closer. I took another step, and then another. Behind me, Kara hissed, "Stop! We need to wake up Ryan and Jess. This isn't right." She was right. Something about the light felt wrong. But before we could move, a voice echoed from the woods. "Help me." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The voice was weak, trembling, like someone in pain. "Did you hear that?" Kara asked, her grip on my arm tightening. I nodded, shining the flashlight toward the trees again, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. The light, the lantern, was gone. The voice, however, came again, closer this time. "Please, help." I felt a chill run down my spine. It didn't sound right. Something about the voice, it was off. It was too hollow, too distant, like it wasn't coming from a real person. Ryan and Jess's tent suddenly unzipped, and Ryan stumbled out, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell's going on?" Before I could answer, Jess screamed. She pointed toward the trees, her face pale as death. "There's something out there." The light was back, this time closer, hovering just beyond the tree line, swaying slowly. Ryan stood frozen, staring at it. What is that?" "We have to go," I said, pulling Kara toward the car. "Now." But before we could take more than a few steps, the light blinked out, leaving us in pitch darkness. And then, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, crunching through the leaves. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Kara's hand as we bolted toward the car. We didn't stop, didn't look back, even as the footsteps followed us, getting louder, closer. The air around us seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping rapidly. My breath came in short gasps, the cold stinging my lungs as we finally reached the car. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking, but finally got the door open. We all piled in, slamming the doors shut. I turned the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the narrow dirt road, my heart pounding in my chest. None of us spoke until we were miles away from the camp, the lights of a small town finally appearing in the distance. Only then did I slow down, my hands still trembling on the wheel. "I saw it," Jess whispered from the back seat, her voice hollow. "The lantern, and someone was holding it." We drove the rest of the way in silence, none of us daring to speak of what we saw. When we got back, we swore never to talk about it again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I hear it again. That soft voice, calling from the woods. "Help me." But I know better now. I know not to follow. And if you ever see a light in the woods at night, don't follow it either, because not everything that glows in the dark wants to be found. I shouldn't have agreed to come here. I knew something was off the moment I set foot in these woods, but when my friend suggested a weekend camping trip to the Black Rock Wilderness, I didn't want to be the one to ruin the fun. Now, sitting alone in my tent, the fire dwindling outside, I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone out here. There are no other campers for miles. This part of the park is notorious for being remote, hard to reach. That's why we chose it. No crowds, no noise, just us, nature, and endless forest, and whatever else lurks in it. The first day was fine. We set up camp, had a few beers, and shared stories around the fire. But as the night wore on, the woods grew eerily quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig. We laughed it off, saying it was probably just deer or some other harmless animal moving in the brush. But deep down I could feel it, the wrongness, and we first noticed it around midnight. Paul, who had wandered off to relieve himself, came back pale, his face drawn tight. He didn't say much, just muttered something about seeing a coyote too close to camp. but when I pressed him, he shook his head, refusing to explain further. Then came the voices. It started as we were preparing to turn in for the night, distant, echoing through the trees, but unmistakably human. A man's voice calling out for help. We froze, listening. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, clutching her sleeping bag tighter. "Probably someone lost," Paul said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Could be another group of campers. But we hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. The voice came again, this time closer. "Help." It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but the desperation in it was real. It sent chills down my spine. "I'll go check it out," Matt said, grabbing his flashlight. He was always the brave one, the first to volunteer for anything risky. The rest of us exchanged nervous glances, but no one protested. We didn't want to seem paranoid. Matt disappeared into the dark trees, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick shadows. The forest swallowed him up, and soon the sound of his footsteps faded into nothing. Minutes passed, then an hour. No sign of Matt. No more voices. "Shouldn't he be back by now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. We tried calling out for him, but there was no response. Just silence, thick and oppressive, pressing in on us from all sides. Paul stood up, pacing near the fire, clearly on edge. "Maybe he got lost. I'll go look for him." "No," I said quickly. "We shouldn't split up again. Let's wait a little longer." Paul reluctantly agreed, but I could see the unease growing in his eyes. We all felt it. Something was wrong out there. Another hour passed and still nothing. The fire was burning low, casting long, flickering shadows across the camp. Then suddenly, from the darkness, we heard it. "Hey, guys." It was Matt's voice coming from the woods. I shot to my feet. "Matt, where are you?" The voice was closer now, just beyond the edge of the firelight. "I'm over here." I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the trees. But there was nothing, just the still, dark forest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Matt, come into the light," I called, my voice shaking slightly. "We can't see you." Silence. Then, after a long pause, the voice came again. "Help me." It was Matt's voice, but wrong. The tone was off, flat and emotionless, like someone trying to mimic him but not quite getting it right. My stomach churned. Paul stepped forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. "Something's not right." Paul shook me off, his face twisted with frustration. "It's Matt. He's probably hurt. We have to help him." He turned and marched toward the sound, his flashlight sweeping through the trees. I followed him, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. Sarah stayed by the fire, eyes wide with fear. "Matt," Paul called out as we stepped into the woods, "where are you, man?" There was no response. Just when I thought maybe Paul had been right, maybe Matt was injured and disoriented, we heard the voice again, this time from behind us. "I'm over here." We spun around, shining the flashlight in the direction we'd just come from. But there was nothing there. My skin crawled. "We need to go back," I said, grabbing Paul's arm again. "Now." Paul hesitated, the confusion clear in his eyes. But before he could say anything, a figure emerged from the shadows, just at the edge of the light. It was Matt, but not. His movements were jerky, wrong, like a puppet on strings. His face was pale, almost waxen, and his eyes, God, his eyes, were black pits, reflecting nothing of the light around us. He stood there, swaying slightly, his mouth hanging open as though he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Then that voice came again, but it didn't come from his mouth. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, echoing all around us. "Help me." Paul took a step back, his face draining of color. "Matt?" The figure that looked like Matt tilted its head, as if considering the question, but didn't respond. Instead, it slowly raised one arm and pointed deeper into the forest. Come with me." I backed away, pulling Paul with me. My heart was racing, my mind screaming that this wasn't real, this couldn't be real. But there it was, standing in front of us. Something that looked like our friend, but wasn't him, couldn't be him. "Run," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush back toward the camp. Behind us, I heard that voice again, distant, but still too close. "Come with me." We burst back into the campsite, gasping for breath. But when we arrived, the fire had gone out. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," Paul yelled, spinning in circles, searching the dark. Then from the trees her voice came, faint, soft. "I'm over here." I grabbed Paul's arm, forcing him to stay put. "No," I said firmly. "That's not her. It's not her." Paul looked at me, terror filling his eyes. He knew I was right. He could feel it too. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat there, huddled in the cold darkness, waiting for the sun to rise. The voices kept coming, circling the camp, first Matt's, then Sarah's. Sometimes closer, sometimes further away, always calling, always asking for us to follow. "Help me. Come with me." By morning, we were both too exhausted to speak. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, we packed up camp in silence, our eyes hollow, our minds reeling. We didn't speak of what we saw, of what we heard. We just walked, leaving the cursed place behind. We never found Sarah or Matt. When we finally made it back to the ranger station, I told the ranger everything. I expected him to be shocked, maybe even call for a search party. But he just looked at me, his face expressionless, and said, "You're lucky you made it out." That's when I realized he knew. He'd always known. We weren't the first. We wouldn't be the last. And whatever's out there in those deep woods, it's still waiting. The forest always had a way of swallowing sound, but tonight it felt like it was swallowing everything. I was deep in the Ouachita National Forest, far enough away from civilization that even the faintest remnants of city noise didn't reach. I liked it that way. Quiet. Isolated. This was my escape, a weekend camping trip to clear my mind. I'd done it dozens of times before, but something about this trip felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the moment I set up camp, I felt off, like I didn't belong here. The air was too still, and the usual chorus of insects and birds was absent. The quiet was almost expectant. I had arrived late, later than I'd wanted thanks to a wrong turn and a few miles of rocky, overgrown trails that nearly swallowed my Jeep. By the time I got my tent pitched and a fire going, the sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving the forest cloaked in darkness. The flames crackled, sending sparks into the air, but the warmth didn't bring me the usual comfort. I sat close to the fire, listening for any sounds, but there was nothing. Just an overwhelming, suffocating silence. Even the wind seemed to avoid this part of the woods. It was then I first heard the voice. "Help!" It was faint, almost lost in the flicker of the flames, but unmistakable. I stood up, heart thudding in my chest, straining to hear. "Help me." It came again, a soft, distant cry, a woman's voice, fragile and weak, echoing from somewhere in the trees. My flashlight swept over the dense forest, illuminating nothing but an endless sea of branches and shadows. I knew better than to go wandering into the woods at night, especially in unfamiliar terrain, but something about that voice gnawed at me. It sounded desperate, broken. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the sound. The deeper I went into the forest, the thicker the air became. The trees, once tall and majestic, now felt like towering walls closing in on me. My footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles, and the farther I ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. "Help, please." The voice grew closer, but something about it was off. It didn't fluctuate, didn't change direction, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I slowed my pace, anxiety creeping up my spine. "Who's there?" I called out. my voice breaking the stillness. Nothing, just that heavy, suffocating quiet, and then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. A woman, dressed in pale, tattered clothing, her back to me. She was thin, almost unnaturally so, her limbs long and frail. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, taking a cautious step closer. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch, just stood there, motionless, as if she hadn't heard me at all. I raised the flashlight higher, and that's when I saw her face, or what was left of it. Her head jerked toward me with a sickening snap, her eyes hollow and sunken, her skin stretched tight over bone, peeling in places, and her mouth, it was wide, too wide, like someone had torn her jaw open at the corners. She stared at me, her lips trembling as though trying to speak, but the only sound that escaped was that same soft cry. "Help me." I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across her figure, and then she was gone, vanished into the trees, as if she'd never been there at all. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I had to go back to camp. I had to leave. But when I turned around, the path was gone. The trees were different now, closer, gnarled, twisted in unnatural ways. There was no trail, no sign of where I'd come from. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest had shifted, rearranged itself around me, and then the whispers started. Soft, unintelligible at first, like the wind moving through the trees, but it wasn't the wind. The whispers were all around me, just beyond the reach of the light, voices overlapping in a chorus of unintelligible murmurs. I spun in a slow circle, the flashlight beam barely piercing the suffocating darkness. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, figures slipping between the trees. Too many to count, too fast to focus on. "Please help me." That voice again, but now it wasn't just one, it was many. The same pleading cry, over and over, coming from all directions. I started running. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The flashlight swung wildly in my hand, its beam cutting through the thick blackness. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed. Louder now, more insistent. The ground beneath my feet became uneven. Roots and rocks tripping me up as I stumbled deeper into the forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. That's when I saw it, a cabin sitting in the middle of a small clearing, its windows dark and empty, like lifeless eyes staring out at me. It wasn't on any map I'd studied, and I knew it shouldn't be here. But I had no other choice. I ran toward it, the whispers growing louder, closer. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The cabin was cold, the air inside stale, as though it had been abandoned for years. My flashlight flickered again, but I didn't care. I collapsed against the door, breathing hard, listening. Silence. For the first time since I'd left camp, the forest was silent. I stood up, shining the flashlight around the small room. It was empty. No furniture, no signs of life. Just a single door at the far end of the room, slightly ajar, leading to what I assumed was a back room. I don't know why I opened it. I should have left, should have run. But something drew me to it, like a moth to a flame. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. My stomach dropped, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave, but my feet moved forward anyway, carrying me down the steps. The basement was colder than the rest of the cabin, the air thick and damp. My flashlight beam swept over the stone walls, revealing nothing but shadows. And then I saw it. A figure hunched in the corner facing the wall. It was human, or at least it had been at one point, but its skin was mottled, gray and decayed, patches of hair clinging to its scalp in uneven tufts. It rocked back and forth, muttering something under its breath. "Please, help me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, the figure turned its head, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't just one person. It was many. Dozens of faces twisted and fused together. mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide and unseeing. The whispers erupted, louder than ever, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, all saying the same thing. "Help me." I backed up, my legs trembling, but before I could reach the stairs, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the thing in the corner began to rise. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the forest, the whispers fading behind me as I ran. Somehow, I found my way back to camp, though I don't know how. The trees had shifted again, the path reappearing as if the forest itself had let me go. I packed up my gear in a frenzy, not caring about the time or the darkness. I just needed to leave, to get out of those woods and never come back. As I drove away, the whispers still echoed in my ears, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw the woman again, standing at the edge of the trees, her hollow eyes watching me leave. I haven't been back since, but sometimes late at night I still hear them. Help me. And I know deep down that the forest isn't done with me yet. I can't believe I'm about to write this down. I've been trying to forget it for months, burying it deep in my mind, pretending it never happened. But the nightmares haven't stopped. The woods, they call to me in my sleep. And every night it feels like I'm one step closer to losing myself. It was supposed to be a quick camping trip, a few days out in the wilderness to clear my head after a nasty breakup. I'd always found peace in nature, the isolation of the deep woods calming, like I could shed my old skin and start fresh. So when I saw an old trail marked on a map at a park ranger station, a trail that supposedly led to an unused campsite, I didn't think twice. It was remote, barely a dot on the map, but that's what I wanted. Just me, the trees, and silence. The park ranger, a wiry older guy with deep lines in his face, frowned when I asked him about the trail. "Not many people go that way anymore," he said, leaning on the counter. His voice had a gravelly edge to it, like he'd smoked one too many cigarettes. "You sure that's where you want to go?" "Why not?" I asked, shrugging off his concern. "I need some solitude." He stared at me for a moment, eyes narrowed. "There's a reason it's unused. People say there's something wrong with those woods. Something watching." I laughed, thinking he was just trying to spook me, but his expression didn't change. "Stick to the trail," he warned, his voice low. "And if you hear anything strange, anything that doesn't sound right, don't follow it." I nodded, pretending to take him seriously, but as I left the station, his words clung to me like a cold fog. Still, I shook off the unease and drove out to the trailhead, ready for a weekend of peace and quiet. The first day was uneventful. I hiked deep into the woods, the sun filtering through the canopy in golden beams. The trail was narrow, barely there in some places, but I followed the faded markers and eventually found the campsite. It was just a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, a fire pit long abandoned in the center. Perfect. Just what I needed. I set up camp, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the trees, the woods came alive with the sounds of nature. Crickets chirping, the distant call of an owl, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd come for. But then, sometime after midnight, the silence fell. Like someone had flipped a switch, every sound in the forest ceased. No more crickets, no wind, just nothing. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding in the sudden stillness. I've camped enough to know that the woods don't just go quiet for no reason. Something was out there. Then I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling from somewhere deep in the trees. "Help me!" It was a woman's voice, soft and pleading, but something about it felt off. It was too perfect, too clear, almost like it had been placed there, like a recording playing just for me. "Help me!" The voice came again, closer this time. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay put, to not even breathe. The ranger's warning flashed in my mind. Don't follow it. But then, curiosity crept in. What if it was real? What if someone was lost out there, hurt, needing help? The rational part of my brain told me it didn't make sense. There was no one else for miles. But I couldn't shake the thought. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, the cold night air biting at my skin. The voice called again, leading me toward the edge of the clearing. "Help me." I shone the flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. But I saw nothing, just endless forest. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Is someone out there?" Silence. I took a few steps into the trees, heart pounding in my chest. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the deeper I went, the thicker the air seemed to get, like the forest itself was closing in on me. That's when I saw it, just ahead, barely visible through the thick trees. A figure. A woman standing in the shadows. She was facing away from me, her long dark hair hanging down her back, her clothes tattered and dirty. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. "Do you need help?" She didn't respond, didn't move. Something was wrong. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to turn back and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't stop myself. I was drawn to her, like a moth to a flame. I took another step forward, flashlight trembling in my hand. "Miss? Are you lost?" Slowly she began to turn. But as her face came into view, my blood ran cold. Her eyes, they were wrong. Black, bottomless pits that seemed to suck in the light from the flashlight. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, far too wide, stretching the skin of her face in ways that shouldn't be possible. "Help me," she whispered, but the words didn't match the movement of her lips. They came from somewhere else, somewhere deep and dark, echoing through the trees like a command. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It flickered out as it hit the ground, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to pick it up, my hands shaking, but when I shone the light back toward the spot where she'd been standing, she was gone. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own breathing, ragged and panicked. Then from behind me, the voice came again, this time right at my ear. "Help me." I ran. I don't even remember how I found my way back to the campsite, but when I burst through the trees, I was gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. I dove into my tent, zipped it up tight, and grabbed the hatchet from my pack, holding it in my trembling hands. The voice didn't follow me, but I could feel it out there, watching, waiting. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sending waves of terror through me. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. I just sat there, gripping the hatchet, praying for dawn. When the first light of morning finally broke through the trees, I didn't waste a second. I packed up my gear in record time and bolted down the trail, barely looking back. I didn't care how far I had to hike. I just needed to get out of those woods. As I reached the trailhead, exhausted and shaking, the park ranger was waiting, leaning against his truck. He didn't say anything, just gave me a knowing look, his face grim. I wanted to tell him what happened, to demand answers, but I couldn't find the words. I just stared at him, my mind racing with everything I'd seen, everything I'd heard. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I told you not to follow it." Without another word, I got in my car and drove away, leaving that cursed place behind. But I know it's not over. The woods, they don't forget. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I hear it. That voice and calling my name and asking for help. I should have known better than to agree to a camping trip in a place like Devil's Hollow. It's one of those spots you hear about growing up. Everyone has a story about it, a friend of a friend who went out there and never came back, or a hiker who heard something they couldn't explain. It was a place whispered about, always with an air of dread. But I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or cryptid sightings. To me, it was just another isolated patch of woods, perfect for an adventurous weekend. My buddy, Jake, had suggested the trip. He was always talking about finding the most remote, untouched places to camp, and Devil's Hollow was at the top of his list. "We'll be miles away from civilization," he'd said with a grin. "No cell service, no people, just nature. It's going to be amazing." I should have said no, but I didn't. We drove out on a Friday afternoon, following a winding, narrow road that seemed to get darker the deeper we went. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows through the dense trees. I felt a weird sense of foreboding, but I shrugged it off as pre-trip jitters. We hiked for hours, deeper into the woods than I'd ever been. There were no trails, just Jake's GPS and his knack for navigation. Eventually, we reached a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. It felt claustrophobic, like the forest was pressing in on us from all sides, but Jake was thrilled. "This is it," he said, dropping his pack with a satisfied smile. "Our own little piece of wilderness." We set up camp, built a fire, and cracked open a few beers. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every crack of a branch, every whisper of the wind. But Jake was in his element, talking excitedly about the hike we'd take in the morning, about how untouched this place was. It wasn't long before things started to get strange. It began with the noises. At first it was subtle, rustling in the bushes, the occasional snap of a twig. We both assumed it was just wildlife, maybe a raccoon or deer moving through the trees. But then the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps. Not the light, random movement of an animal, but heavy, slow steps, like something was circling the camp just beyond the firelight. "Probably just a bear," Jake said, though he didn't sound as confident as he tried to. We both grabbed flashlights and shone them into the trees, the beams cutting through the thick blackness. But there was nothing, no eyes shining back, no movement, just trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped, and after a while we tried to relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something, a low, distant growl, or the crunch of leaves, like something was moving closer. But every time I sat up and looked around, there was nothing there, just the dark, empty woods. In the morning we found something that made my blood run cold. About 20 feet from our tent, scratched into the dirt, were strange markings. At first they looked like claw marks, long and deep, but as I studied them closer, I realized they weren't random. They were symbols, rough, jagged shapes carved into the ground like some kind of crude language. Jake tried to play it off, saying it was probably just some prank from another camper, but we hadn't seen a soul since we arrived. No one should have been out here, and I wanted to leave right then and there, pack up and get the hell out. But Jake, always the adventurous one, insisted we stay. "It's probably nothing," he said, though I could tell he was shaken too. "We came all the way out here. Let's not let some weird markings freak us out." So, against my better judgment, I stayed. The day was uneventful, though the feeling of being watched never went away. I kept catching glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, dark shapes slipping between the trees. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Jake pretended not to notice, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. By the time night fell, the unease had grown into full-blown fear. The woods seemed to close in on us, the trees looming tall and oppressive. The fire felt too small, too dim, and the sounds, the footsteps, the rustling, started again, this time louder, closer. I was sitting by the fire staring into the flames when I heard it. A voice. "Help! Me!" It was faint, almost a whisper drifting through the trees. I looked at Jake, thinking maybe he'd said something, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He'd heard it too. "Help! Me!" It came again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, weak and trembling, somewhere in the darkness. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my mouth dry. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah." We both stood, shining our flashlights into the trees, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of black forest. "Maybe someone's lost," Jake said, though his voice was shaking. "We should check it out." "No way," I snapped. "Something's not right. We need to stay by the fire." But Jake, ever the hero, ignored me and started walking toward the voice, calling out, "Hello? Where are you?" I stayed behind, heart pounding in my chest as I watched the beam of his flashlight bob through the trees, growing fainter the farther he went. And then, just like that, the light disappeared. "Jake!" I yelled, panic gripping me. There was no answer. I stood there trembling, torn between chasing after him and staying by the fire. But before I could make a decision, I heard footsteps. Fast, running footsteps, crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the noise, expecting to see Jake sprinting back toward the camp. But it wasn't Jake, it was something else. I barely had time to register what I was seeing before it was upon me. Tall, hunched, its skin a mottled gray, like something long dead. Its face, if you could call it a face, was a twisted, snarling mass of sharp angles and empty eyes, and its mouth, it was wide, too wide, filled with jagged teeth. I screamed, stumbling backward as the thing barreled toward me, its long clawed hands outstretched. But just as it reached the edge of the firelight, it stopped. It recoiled, hissing like an animal, its black eyes fixed on the flames. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the burning end of a log from the fire and swung it at the creature. It let out a shriek that rattled my bones and disappeared into the darkness, the sound of its retreating footsteps fading into the night. I didn't wait for Jake. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, through the trees, through the underbrush, not stopping until I reached the road, breathless and shaking. Jake never came out of those woods. The search teams never found him. But every so often late at night I hear that voice again. "Help! Me!" And I know it's not him. It was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation. Just me and two of my closest friends, camping deep in the forest, far away from the chaos of the city. I don't know why we chose that forest, why we didn't listen to the rumors. Locals talked about strange sightings, unsettling disappearances, but we laughed it off. Cryptids, skinwalkers, all that supernatural nonsense. It was just stories, right? That's what we thought. Now, I wish we hadn't been so naive. We arrived in the late afternoon, sunlight casting a golden hue through the towering trees. The air smelled fresh, pure, untouched by civilization. A small clearing next to a creek seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. It was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the babbling water. Too quiet, in retrospect. After pitching the tents and gathering wood for the fire, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest quickly turned dark. It felt like the trees themselves closed in around us, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers over our camp. But I brushed off the creeping unease. We were safe. We had each other, a fire, and the stars above. We sat around the fire telling jokes and sharing stories, the flames flickering in the cool night air. But after a while the conversation lulled, and we all noticed it at once, the strange silence. The crickets had stopped chirping, the wind had died down, even the creek seemed to have stilled. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "Did you guys hear that?" Dan, my friend, broke the silence. We listened. At first nothing. Then it came. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper from the darkness. It was too soft to make out, like a voice carried on the wind, but it wasn't the wind. It sounded wrong, like someone mimicking human speech but just missing the mark. We laughed it off, trying to ignore the chill creeping up our spines, assuming it was just the trees or our imaginations playing tricks. But it wasn't. The whispers continued just on the edge of our hearing, circling the camp. I could see it in the others' faces. Something wasn't right. We tried to distract ourselves, to talk louder, but the fire didn't feel warm anymore. It felt like something cold and unseen was pressing against us, waiting. Around midnight, Dan stood up abruptly, his eyes wide, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. "I saw something," he muttered. "Something watching us." "Quit messing around," I said, though I could feel the tightness in my throat. But Dan wasn't laughing. He pointed toward the trees, his hand shaking. There was something, standing between the trees, looking at us. We all stared into the darkness, straining our eyes. The firelight barely reached the edge of the trees, leaving the forest in pitch blackness. My heart was pounding. Every shadow seemed to twist and writhe, but I didn't see anything. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Something tall, unnaturally tall, slipped between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be human. I barely caught a glimpse. Long limbs, pale skin, moving on all fours like a distorted version of a person. "We need to go," Sarah, my other friend, whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to leave now." But leaving wasn't an option. The forest was too dark, and we had no idea what was out there. So we stayed by the fire, huddled close, trying to convince ourselves that it was just a deer or some wild animal. But deep down, we knew. This was no animal. As the hours dragged on, the whispers grew louder, closer. They circled us, sometimes sounding like laughter, other times like someone calling our names. But we never saw who or what was making the sounds. Every now and then we'd catch glimpses of it, something slinking between the trees, just out of reach, always watching. It seemed to enjoy toying with us, staying hidden just long enough to keep us terrified. The worst part was when the footprints started. At first we didn't notice, but as dawn began to creep closer, Sarah gasped. There, in the dirt around our camp, were footprints. Large, clawed, but not quite animal. And the worst part? There were too many of them, coming from every direction, circling, closing in on us. The panic set in. "We have to go," Dan yelled. "I don't care if it's dark. We have to leave." We gathered our things in a rush, leaving half of it behind, and bolted for the path we came in on. But the path was different. It was like the forest had shifted, the trees standing closer, the underbrush thicker. And then came the sound. A howl, low, guttural, and unlike anything I'd ever heard. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It echoed through the forest, followed by the sound of something crashing through the trees. Something big. We ran, but no matter how fast we moved, it felt like we were being herded, pushed deeper into the forest. The thing, whatever it was, kept pace with us, its heavy footsteps just behind the trees. Occasionally I'd see those glowing red eyes in the distance, staring at us with a malevolent intelligence, watching us panic. And then Sarah screamed. I turned just in time to see her vanish. One moment she was there, running beside me. The next, she was gone, pulled into the darkness. I heard her scream echo through the trees, but it was cut short, as if something had muffled her, smothered her sound. Dan and I ran faster, but the forest seemed endless. The trail was gone, the landmarks unfamiliar. The whispers grew louder, closer, and I could swear I heard Sarah's voice among them, calling my name, but twisted, wrong. It wasn't her. By some miracle, we stumbled back into the clearing where the car was parked. Dan scrambled for the keys, hands shaking, while I kept my eyes on the tree line. I could feel it, whatever was hunting us, just beyond the shadows, watching, waiting. Finally, the engine roared to life and we sped down the dirt road, the forest disappearing behind us. The feeling of relief was short-lived, though. I could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent. Even over the roar of the engine, they were following us, carrying on the wind. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, and even then we didn't speak. What could we say? Sarah was gone, lost to whatever was out there. We couldn't explain it, and no one would believe us if we tried. That was 3 days ago. Dan hasn't spoken since, barely eats, barely sleeps. I can't stop hearing those whispers. No matter where I go, no matter how loud I play the TV or the radio, they're always there, just on the edge of my hearing, and sometimes at night I catch a glimpse of something tall, something wrong, standing just outside my window. I've spent most of my life in the woods. I'm a ranger by trade, but more than that, the wilderness is where I feel most at peace. There's something comforting about the isolation, the towering pines, and the sounds of nature. I've hiked every inch of this park, camped in places no one else has, and encountered wildlife that would send most folks running. So, when I got assigned to a remote area of the park, far from the main trails, it was supposed to be just another routine patrol. The locals call it Dead Man's Hollow. It's an old stretch of forest, untouched for decades. There's a story about a hiker who disappeared out here back in the 70s, never found a body. People love to gossip, but I've never put much stock in those tales. Still, the area's remote, deep woods even for a seasoned ranger like me. It's the kind of place where the trees close in on you, swallowing every bit of light, every sound, except for what the forest chooses to reveal. I arrived just before dusk, planning to spend the night and hike back out in the morning. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became. It wasn't just the thickness of the trees or the lack of a trail. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I dismissed it as my imagination. This wasn't my first time dealing with the unnerving silence of the wilderness. Setting up camp was easy enough, but as the sun began to sink below the horizon, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. The first was the quiet. These woods are supposed to be alive with sound, crickets, the rustle of small animals, the occasional owl. But there was nothing, not a single chirp, just the soft whistle of wind moving through the branches, but even that felt off, like the wind itself didn't belong here. Then there was the smell, faint at first, like something rotting far off, carried on the breeze. It didn't register as anything dangerous at the time, but it lingered at the edge of my awareness, mixing with the damp, earthy scent of the forest floor. I figured an animal had died nearby, and the breeze was just carrying the stench. As the fire crackled and the night set in, I started hearing something in the distance. Footsteps, or at least what I thought were footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, too heavy to be an animal, but too quiet to be a person confidently walking through the brush. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing except the dark, tangled shapes of trees stretching on forever. I sat by the fire, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. You learn to trust your gut in the woods, an instinct that warns you when predators are near. But this was different. It was like the forest itself was keeping a secret. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse of movement just at the edge of my vision, but every time I turned my head, it was gone. That smell came back, stronger now. It was closer, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just something dead. It was something foul, wrong in a way that made my stomach turn. I felt eyes on me again, and that's when I heard it. Low, guttural breathing, barely audible above the fire's crackle. It wasn't my own breath. I wasn't imagining this. I stood up, scanning the perimeter again with my flashlight. The beam caught on something, two glowing eyes reflecting the light from deeper in the woods, just beyond the reach of the fire. I froze, heart racing, as the eyes vanished into the underbrush without a sound. Whatever it was, it moved like a ghost. There, 1 second, gone the next. I've seen wolves, bears, even mountain lions, but this didn't feel like any animal I've ever encountered. I could hear those footsteps again, circling the campsite, slow and methodical, like it was testing me, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but every hair on my body stood on end. Something was out there. Something that didn't belong in these woods. That's when I heard the voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. Help. Me. It echoed from the trees, distorted, like it was being carried on the wind. It sounded human, but there was something off. Something that twisted my gut with primal fear. The words came again, clearer this time. "Please, help me." I grabbed my radio, but it was dead, not even static. My gut told me to stay by the fire, but against my better judgment, I took a few steps toward the sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a trap, but some part of me, a stupid, reckless part, needed to know. As I moved deeper into the woods, the smell grew overpowering, choking. That's when I saw it. A figure hunched over in the dark. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw it clearly. It was no person. It was a thing. Long, too long, its limbs stretched unnaturally, its skin pale and taut, like it had been pulled too tight over its bones. It stood on two legs but crouched low, moving with an eerie, fluid grace. And its face, God, that face. It had no eyes, just hollow black sockets, and its mouth, too wide, filled with sharp, yellowed teeth, was twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. The smell, rotten, sulfuric, was coming from it. The thing raised its head, and in a voice that didn't belong to it, it spoke again. "Help, me?" It sounded like the voice of the hiker who'd disappeared decades ago, but I knew this creature wasn't human. It was mimicking. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but the thing just watched me, tilting its head like it was waiting to see what I would do next. Then, it stood up to its full height, at least 7 feet tall, and began to move toward me. Slow, deliberate, stalking. I turned and ran. The footsteps behind me were loud, crashing through the brush like an animal, but there was something horribly wrong about the rhythm. It was off, like it was trying to mimic the sound of running, but couldn't quite get it right. I burst into the clearing where my camp was, only to find the fire had gone out. The darkness pressed in on me from all sides. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but when I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. My radio was still dead, my flashlight flickering, and that thing, I could still hear it. Farther away now, but its voice echoed through the trees. "Help me!" I never found my camp again. When morning came, I stumbled onto an old, forgotten logging road, disoriented and shaken. I made it out of the woods, but something followed me. I still hear it sometimes in the dead of night, outside my cabin. It's always the same voice, calling from the trees. "Help me!" I'd been camping in these woods for years, ever since I was a kid. I knew them like the back of my hand, every trail, every hidden creek. But this time something felt off. Maybe it was the cold, sharper than usual for late October, or maybe it was the quiet. Too quiet. I'd been out with my buddy Jake, just a weekend trip, nothing fancy. He was back at camp, getting the fire going while I ventured deeper to collect more firewood. We weren't far from the trailhead, maybe half a mile, but once the sun began to set, the forest shifted. The trees grew darker, thicker. Even the smell in the air changed. Something damp, rotten. The kind of smell that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I picked up a few more branches and started back toward camp when I heard it, a low growl. Not close, but close enough to make me stop dead in my tracks. My heart thudded in my chest, and I stood still, listening. It came again, this time closer. A deep, guttural snarl from somewhere in the shadows. I turned, scanning the trees, my eyes trying to adjust to the growing darkness. "Jake?" I called out, hoping maybe he was messing with me, but there was no reply. Just the wind rustling the leaves overhead. Then I saw something move, a figure, tall and hunched, stepping between the trees about 30 yards away. It was too big to be a person, but it walked on 2 legs, its movements unnatural, jerky, like it didn't belong. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but as soon as it came into view, it was gone, swallowed up by the woods. My breath caught in my throat. I've been hunting all my life. I know what's out here. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't normal. I gripped the bundle of firewood tighter, telling myself to get back to camp. The faster, the better. The walk back felt longer than it should have, like the trees had shifted while I was gone. Every step, I felt like something was behind me, watching, following. The forest seemed to close in around me, the path barely visible in the dimming light. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I saw nothing, just dark shapes in the distance, barely moving, as if they were alive but frozen in place. By the time I reached camp, the fire was crackling, but Jake was nowhere to be seen. I dropped the wood and called out for him again. Silence, just the fire popping and the wind through the trees. "Jake?" I yelled louder, but the only answer was that same growl, this time so close it seemed to rumble from behind the tent. My heart raced as I fumbled for my flashlight, shining it into the trees. The beam swept across the trunks, illuminating nothing but branches and leaves, their shadows dancing eerily in the flickering firelight. But then I saw it again. The figure. Closer now, its eyes reflecting the light back at me. 2 glowing orbs, staring, unblinking. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with long limbs and skin stretched tight across its frame. Its face, if you could call it that, was twisted, wrong, like something wearing a human mask but not knowing how it should fit. I froze, my mind racing. What the hell was it? A bear? No. A person? Definitely not. "Jake?" I whispered, as if somehow he'd step out from behind the trees and tell me this was all some sick joke. But then the thing moved, fast, disappearing behind the trees, the snapping of twigs echoing in its wake. I wasn't alone out here. Whatever that thing was, it was real, and it was hunting me. I backed up toward the campfire, my heart hammering in my chest. I had my knife, but what good would it do against that? I tried to steady my breathing, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. That's when I saw something else. Footprints. They were all around the camp, but not Jake's. No, these were large, clawed, like a mix between human and something animal. I crouched down, examining them, when I saw another print, a bare foot, smaller. Human. A chill ran down my spine as I followed the tracks toward the trees. They led off into the woods just past the fire's edge. And next to the human print, blood. Small drops at first, then a smear, leading away from camp. My stomach dropped. "Jake?" I shouted again, panic rising in my voice. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, following the trail deeper into the woods. The prints became harder to follow, but the blood was fresh, glistening on the dead leaves. It was him. I knew it. The trail led me to a small clearing. That's when I saw him. Jake was standing at the edge of the clearing, his back to me. His clothes were torn, covered in dirt and blood. Relief washed over me as I rushed forward, calling his name. But then he turned around. It wasn't Jake. The thing that faced me had Jake's body, but its eyes were wrong, milky, vacant, and its mouth too wide, stretching unnaturally into a grin, the corners of his lips splitting, revealing jagged teeth where there shouldn't be any. I stumbled back, horrified, as it took a step toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The thing wearing Jake's skin tilted its head, studying me, its voice coming out in a garbled, distorted version of my friend's. "Don't run." I did the opposite. I sprinted back through the trees, not caring about the branches that tore at my clothes, my skin. Behind me, I heard it moving, faster than any human should be able to, crashing through the underbrush. The growling started again, louder, closer, but now mixed with a sound I will never forget. The sound of laughter, warped and wrong. I burst through the trees and back into the clearing with the campfire, breathless and terrified. I grabbed my pack, fumbling for the keys to the truck. The laughter grew closer, that thing coming closer with each passing second. I didn't dare look back. As I sped out of the woods, I saw them in the rearview mirror. Figures, tall and thin, standing just at the tree line, watching, waiting. Too many of them, their eyes glowing in the darkness, reflecting the tail lights as I tore down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I was miles away. The next day when I reported Jake missing, the rangers just looked at me with those same empty eyes. "People disappear out there," one of them said, his voice flat, emotionless. "It's just the way of the woods." I never went back, but sometimes late at night I still hear the laughter. I've always been a rational person. I don't scare easily and I don't believe in monsters. But there are things out there in the deep woods. Things I can't explain. Things that don't make sense. I learned that the hard way. This happened last summer. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I had been planning a camping trip for months, a break from our hectic lives. We found a spot deep in the Black Hills of South Dakota, far from any trails or campsites. It was remote, quiet, and perfect. Exactly what we needed. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long golden beams through the thick trees. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled like pine and damp earth. We set up the tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a peaceful night under the stars. The first strange thing happened as we were eating dinner by the fire. The forest around us, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, suddenly went silent. No wind, no animals, just nothing. "I've heard the woods go quiet when there's a predator nearby," Sarah said, looking around, her voice hushed. She tried to laugh it off, but there was a nervous edge to her tone. "Probably just a coyote or something," I replied, trying to sound reassuring, though the silence unnerved me too. But it was more than that. The quiet wasn't natural. It was oppressive, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. That's when I noticed it, the distinct feeling that we weren't alone. I can't explain it, but it was like the trees had eyes. Every shadow, every darkened crevice between the branches felt like it was hiding something just beyond sight. But I pushed the feeling down. There were no other campsites nearby, no trails, no people for miles. It was just us, and I was overreacting. Or so I thought. After dinner, we sat around the fire talking, trying to enjoy the evening. But the quiet persisted, and it made everything feel wrong. The flames flickered weakly, and no matter how much wood I added, they barely seemed to brighten the darkness. It was like the night itself was swallowing the light. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice barely more than a whisper. I listened. At first I heard nothing, just the soft crackle of the fire. But then, faintly, I caught it, a low, distant hum. It wasn't wind or the rustling of leaves. It was something else, something mechanical almost. It made my skin crawl. "Maybe it's a plane or something," I said, though I knew that didn't make sense. We were too far out for that, and the sound was too low, too strange. Then came the tapping, and it started slow, faint, like someone gently knocking on wood coming from the trees just beyond the light of our fire. Tap, tap, tap. At first I thought it might be a woodpecker, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too spaced out, like someone or something was mimicking the sound. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "That's not an animal," she said, her voice trembling. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight and shining it into the trees. "Hello?" I called out, but the moment the light swept through the darkness, the tapping stopped. The trees stood still, their gnarled branches swaying slightly in the night breeze. Nothing moved. Nothing answered. I stood there, my heart racing, listening, but the tapping didn't return. "Maybe we should just go to bed," Sarah suggested after a long pause, her voice tight with fear. I agreed, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay awake, to keep watch. But what was I going to do? Stand guard all night because of some weird noise? So we crawled into the tent, zipped ourselves in, and tried to sleep. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to the silence. Every little creak or rustle made me jump. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I started to drift off. That's when I heard it, Sarah's voice. She was outside the tent calling my name, softly, almost sweetly, like she was trying to coax me out. "Come here," she whispered. "I want to show you something." I froze. My blood turned to ice in my veins. Sarah was lying right next to me, her breathing slow and steady. I could feel the warmth of her body against mine. The voice called again, a little louder this time, still soft, but with an edge of impatience. "Come here, please. I need you." I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake her, but I couldn't even muster the courage to shake her awake. I just lay there, paralyzed, listening. The voice circled the tent, slow, deliberate. "I know you can hear me." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would stop, praying it wouldn't try to come inside. And then, silence. It felt like hours passed before I finally opened my eyes again. The darkness in the tent was suffocating, but I could hear Sarah breathing beside me, still asleep. Whatever it was, it had gone. The rest of the night was a blur of half-sleep and constant fear. I woke at every sound, every movement. I thought about unzipping the tent, about grabbing our things and running for the car, but I couldn't bring myself to move. All I could do was wait for morning. When the sun finally rose, it was as if nothing had happened. The woods came back to life, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. Everything was normal again, but I wasn't fooled. I knew something had been out there. We packed up quickly, neither of us saying much, but I could tell Sarah had heard it too. She looked pale, shaken, but like me, she wasn't ready to talk about it. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. Just a shadow, a figure slipping behind the trees. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just the silent forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. We made it back to the car by late afternoon. As we loaded up and drove away, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, like we had just narrowly escaped something we weren't supposed to see. But as we pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure, tall, thin, its body twisted and wrong, like it didn't quite belong to this world. And though it had no face, I knew it was watching us, waiting for the next time someone would wander too deep into its woods. I haven't been camping since. I don't know if I ever will again.